Chapter 141. Jason Morgan, with a lump swollen on his forehead, felt he was out of luck. He was a clerk at a small factory inside Revival City, doing some statistical work. With no special skills or power, he diligently performed his duties, earning his due salary. Life was much better than it was for starving refugees outside the city, but was by no means wealthy. He could barely afford a room within the inner city and, with his wife's income, just managed to support their 3 children. After the war, his wife, taken in by some superstition, believed that the newly established government by the incoming governor was reliable. She not only joined it herself but also persuaded him at home for 2 days. "We're literate, we can do math, we have work experience, we can make it big." It's said that Lady Asana got promoted to such a high position just because she could read. "The sooner we get in, the better. If we ingratiate ourselves early, we might also become important people someday." Bewitched, he agreed and, after initial political screening and training, was dispatched to the Immigration Bureau under the Civil Affairs Department. At that time, he thought that though it was tough and he had to leave the city to work, just looking at the E9 rank set for him initially, combined with the basic rank quota with his wife, was enough to feed the family. Add to that the salary beyond the quota, their quality of life wouldn't be reduced at all compared to before. Moreover, just before this business trip, the newly appointed head of their bureau, encouraging them, said that this was a valuable experience. If they did the job well, it would all be counted as meritorious service. He promised to apply for the Rejuvenation Medal for those with the most outstanding performance and give priority to promotion in both rank and position upon their return. Morgan was fed to the full by these promises. Coupled with the extra allowance for the trip, it all sounded advantageous. After discussing with his wife that evening, supported by her, he signed up that very night. The next day, a work group was formed, and a vehicle took them, a group of people, to Major Perbuff's military force. Dealing with the first settlement of about 1,000 people, they were a bit frantic and encountered some difficulties and setbacks, but ultimately, they managed to handle it. They even became the first group to complete the relocation task, and when reporting to their leaders via telegram, they received commendation from their director. He was in high spirits until, without any rest, they were sent overnight to newly liberated Sanchi Town. Nov. L.B//JNN. Sanchi Town had a population of over 3,000. According to the former leader of the town, the name Sanchi came from 3 large pools surrounding the town from which they could harvest some aquatic products that they relied on for a living. They would consume part of it and dry the rest to make dried fish and canned goods for export. Additionally, the town's location was favorable, with traders passing through regularly. They ran a small tavern and provided food, lodging, and recreational services to traders, which kept the town's livelihood modestly sustainable. Following such a narrative, the first direction the work team took was that the town could be preserved. It could serve as a trade transit point, and the 3 productive lakes could also serve as aquaculture sites for food production. They began their work along this direction. However, after some field surveys, they quickly noticed that something was off. There were 3 pools, but they were just 3 ponds. They couldn't be called ponds, at most, very small lakes. There was some aquatic production, but it was clearly limited due to poor management. And the tavern? There was indeed one, but adding up the rooms, there were probably only about 10, and the first floor had 20 or so tables, hardly a trading station. If this were just a small village of a few hundred people, those 3 pools plus the tavern might just about manage to make a decent living. But 3,000? They would have starved long ago, relying on that, right? The people of Sanchi Town had lied. At first, Morgan didn't understand why they would lie, but on the 3rd night after the military left, leaving only their work group behind, he saw crates of weapons and equipment being moved out of a warehouse and the townspeople began arming themselves. That's when he knew something was terribly wrong. Those people had pretended to surrender unconditionally and show loyalty to the military as soon as they arrived, and as soon as the military left, they began to arm themselves. Lately, he saw a large number of looters enter the town, getting along well with the townspeople. Combining this with the previously investigated mismatch between industry and population scale, he finally realized that they had walked into a den of thieves. No wonder how those 3 small pools in a run-down tavern could support 3,000 people. The town didn't rely on that for sustenance at all. Trade route transit point. They indeed depended on trade along the route for sustenance, but perhaps not in the way he thought before. Running shady inns, highway robbery. If they said their livelihood was related to merchants, that wouldn't be wrong. Add to that plundering and extorting other settlements, along with acting as a hub for robbers to deal with stolen goods, provide supplies, and hide out as a criminal center. Well, then it wouldn't be a problem to support a population of 3,000. Jason Morgan, covered in cold sweat and not daring to finish urinating for fear of being noticed, tiptoed back to his room and told his other 6 colleagues about his discovery. Chapter 142. Everyone was somewhat panicked. Even during the most intense battles in Revival City before, all they did was listen to the sound of gunfire and feel the vibrations when the orbital bombardments hit the wind farms on the outskirts of the city, shivering with fear inside their homes. But as for a clear and present physical threat, it hadn't been as palpable as now. If they stayed any longer, death was certain. The plunderers, no matter what they were planning, clearly weren't going to let them go. The 7 people discussed and decided to make a run for it before those guys came to trouble them and restricted their movement. Unfortunately, it was too late. They were no stealth experts, not even soldiers, they had no training in this area, how could they possibly sneak out of a town unnoticed? In fact, they hadn't gotten far before they were caught. Morgan was struck on the head with 2 strikes of a gun butt, leaving him dizzy. By the time he regained most of his senses, he and his colleagues were already tied up in a room. Now, all he felt was regret, immense regret. Back then, choosing to go on a business trip had been because he was dazzled by the pie in the sky painted by his boss, blinded by the extra travel allowance. He had only seen the benefits and forgotten how dangerous the wasteland was. Now what? No choice, just wait for death, said one person optimistically. A true pessimist would have said, is there any way to die quickly, preferably painlessly? The plunderers here actually eat people, and some even more twisted, to ensure the meat is fresh, slice and roast while the victim is still alive. Morgan, who had just recovered from his dizziness, was scared almost to the point of fainting again upon hearing their conversation. Wait, just a few days ago I was at home enjoying a blissful future with my wife, and now you are telling me I might be skinned alive? His mindset was collapsing. Morgan didn't want to die. He shook his head, trying to think of a way out but couldn't. The 7 of them were tied up tightly, thrown on the ground, struggling even to squirm like caterpillars, let alone think of a way to untie themselves. It would be futile anyway, they were unarmed, and there were 2 armed plunderers guarding the door. What to do? No matter how hard he racked his brain, he couldn't think of a solution. And then an even more despairing situation arose. He heard footsteps outside. It seemed like several people were coming over, then started talking to the guards at the door, and then there was some arguing. The conversation was slightly muffled by the door and wall, but it sounded like orders, to come, is it these people, execute, just bury outside, release, no good. Those words made Morgan go pale. It's over. They were coming to execute them. As he thought this, the door was opened. He saw 3 armed plunderers walk in. Morgan was terrified. He felt that everything was over. At that moment, all he could do was close his eyes, preparing to face death, praying his end would be swift. But just then, he heard one of the newcomers speak. Chief Terrell's orders are to kill all of you. Just as I thought. Morgan thought to himself. Then he heard a twist that gave him a flicker of hope. But I can let you go, only if you agree to one condition. Before Morgan could speak, his colleague beat him to it. What condition? The newcomer sighed. Chief Terrell insists on opposing Revival City, which I disagree with. I see this as an opportunity to wash my hands of this, stop plundering, and live as a peaceful citizen of Revival City. What's wrong with that? He paused, then added with some dejection, but, I can't change his mind. So, I took the task to execute you, but I want to let you go. When Terrell is defeated, you must remember my kindness. If I'm captured, you have to rescue me. If I escape, I hope you report this and help us secure a place in the new alliance. Morgan hurriedly responded, thumping his chest, of course. We'll certainly do that. The others also hurriedly made various promises. The newcomer relaxed a little and threw them some clothes, then quickly change into these, and I can find a route to have my men escort you out. I still have to find some bodies to burn as yours, we're short on time. Morgan and the others sprang into action. While hurriedly changing, it crossed his mind. The promotional work for the new alliance policies in Sanchi town was actually effective. After changing, Morgan and the others were led out. At the moment of parting, Morgan hesitated but still said, you might as well escape with us. Otherwise, if your act of releasing us is exposed, it could be very dangerous. If I escape with you, we won't make it. My identity will cover for you. As for the risk of exposure, I'll be prepared. All right then. Since the man had said so, Morgan didn't insist, but he asked another question. What's your name? I'm Ready Boar. Ready Boar, these 7, are they really from the new alliance? Faced with Chief Terrell's question, no matter how much turmoil was in his heart, at least Ball managed to maintain a calm exterior. Of course. Chief Terrell's green eye peered at him for a good while, then turned his gaze onto the other members beside Ball. Then tell me, why is it that your Captain Ball specifically wants the bodies burnt? Chapter 143. Ball opened his mouth, hoping to speak, but Chief Terrell lifted a hand to stop him. Shut your mouth. I didn't ask you. Say one more word, and I'll kill you, he said. Ball could only close his mouth and remain silent. The brothers beside him, however, couldn't maintain the composure that he had when facing the notorious and brutal Chief Terrell. Terrell looked at these men with their nervous and confused expressions and revealed a fierce grin. Speak up. The one who speaks, I'll spare your life, he said. Finally, someone couldn't resist any longer. A tall, thin fellow quickly distanced himself from his brothers and said, it was Ball. Ball convinced us to do this. He let the person go, talking about needing to keep a way out, not to take things too far. As these words were spoken, Ball and the comrades next to him turned pale. Some were shaking so badly they could barely stand, others cursed the traitor, some sought to make excuses. Ball's gaze, however, was locked on Terrell. At this moment, life and death lay within the great leader's whim. As the noise gradually subsided, Terrell calmly took out a gun and spoke, do you have anything else to say? Taking a deep breath, Ball answered, all I did was for the good of our brothers. If we killed everyone, we'd make an enemy for life, and then... You're pretty good at keeping options open for yourself, he was interrupted. Ball tried a different approach, earnestly pleading, Chief, I've followed you for 10 years now. The brothers from the early days are dead or missing, and few of us are left. We've built a great enterprise, with thousands dependent on us for a living, and we've united many tribes around us. We've come to an end here. What will come next? We couldn't stand against the old alliance government, and we stand even less of a chance against the new alliance government. Haven't you seen the army that recently came here? They have armored vehicles. They have tanks. They have artillery. Are we really meant to fight such an enemy? Though we greatly outnumber them, and we have the advantage of surprise, even if we win, they will send a second, a third army. We can't afford such losses. What's wrong with taking this chance to join the new alliance's system? All the brothers would have a place, and you could still lead us, enlisted by the alliance, into the army. Look at that Major Perbuff, how impressive he seemed arriving in that armored vehicle. In the future, you could also be a general. Wouldn't that be good? I really don't understand why you insist on being a bandit, a plunderer. Ball's words indeed came across as sincere. Regrettably, Terrell was utterly unmoved. He quietly said, are you done? I'm done, Ball replied. For the sake of your father, who once saved my life, and for the 10 years you've been with me, I gave you a chance to speak. You know, if you begged for mercy, I would have let you live, but unfortunately, you have said such things, Terrell responded. He pulled the trigger. The bullet mercilessly passed through Ball's head. The raider captain immediately fell to the ground, lifeless. Terrell looked at the other followers of Ball with disgust and waved his hand, kill all these traitors. A burst of gunfire ensued, leaving no one alive. Then, Terrell turned to the fellow who had reported Ball earlier. The man was so scared that he was about to wet his pants. You said you would spare my life. Yes, Terrell approached him, his hands gripping the man's head, I did say that. I will forgive your act of betrayal, but you caused the death of my dear nephew Ball, I never said I would forgive you for that. You. The man barely had time to say anything more when he felt a tremendous force. Terrell broke his neck with his bare hands. After executing the men, the raiders dragged the bodies away, while others continued to keep watch. Terrell turned to the few people who had been standing behind him, watching the scene unfold, and with a grin said, in my life, I despise traitors the most. I apologize for the display, gentlemen. Nothing to apologize for, Chief. You're still merciful, someone replied. "I don't know how old Ball could produce such a naive fool of a son," remarked another. "We've roamed this wasteland for so many years, relying on our guns, being tougher than anyone else. To expect us to lay down our arms and become farmers, workers? Hell, I'd rather die." Among those standing behind Terrell were some of his tribal leaders and some raider chiefs he had invited from elsewhere. At this moment, they were all clamoring, praising Terrell for the killing. Meanwhile, they left unsaid what was tacitly understood among them. What Ball had said wasn't entirely without merit. Were the days of being raiders actually that good? They burned, killed, and plundered, but there had to be something to plunder. Finding a fat sheep, a wealthy merchant, a survivor's camp with some savings, they could have a full meal, but such opportunities were not always there, and people wouldn't just willingly hand over their possessions. To rob at gunpoint meant risking lives. Even after attaining significant military strength, they dared not ruthlessly plunder many camps. They had to learn sustainable development. They would demand tribute from weaker survivor camps. But those camps barely eked out an existence themselves. How much could they give? In times when life was hard for everyone, the raiders didn't feast on meat and drink every day. Chapter 144. In Sanchi town, during hard times, it was common for people to starve to death. Those who survived would divide and consume the dead, in an effort to endure the lean years. Under such circumstances, if what the officers from the new alliance were saying was true, as long as you worked, basic food and warmth were guaranteed, then what harm was there in becoming a farmer, a worker, or even a soldier? For the lower class plunderers, it was indeed so, but it was different for those present. No matter how hard the days were, could they ever really become unbearable for their leaders? After all, they were the rulers. They received offerings, they commanded thousands of plunderers, roaming freely through the wastelands, whistling past, living with satisfaction. Having joined the new alliance, those middle and lower class looters could perhaps conceal their pasts and live peaceful lives. But what about these leaders? Could they still dictate and act recklessly? I'm afraid not. It was nearly impossible to expect a group of plunderer leaders to think of the greater good, considering the welfare of all their subordinates, and giving up their privileges. However, their minds weren't completely controlled by selfish desires, forgetting the reality of the situation. They were well aware that, in their current state, even though they had a few thousand guns, it was still unrealistic to confront directly the troops led by Major Prabuff. Numerous men and guns they had, but they were seriously lacking in heavy firepower. With only 20 light mountain cannons and some individual rocket launchers, they could threaten the heavy armored vehicles, but the risk was too high. Deploying all their forces might not guarantee the destruction of even a few tanks. A single anti-tank group encountering an armored vehicle or tank definitely had the potential to cause damage, but the requirements were too stringent. It wasn't impossible for them to stealthily approach within a few dozen meters and then hit the vehicle's side armor with 2 or 3 armor-piercing rockets. But it was more likely they'd be discovered before getting close, and then a barrage from the enemy would wipe them all out. It was precisely for this reason that they had never considered a head-on collision with the new alliance's military forces. Otherwise, there would have been no need to play the part of compliant citizens when Major Prabuff first arrived with his troops. In fact, they were prepared to give up on Sanchi town altogether. They weren't any sort of legitimate settlement, whether it was the industry Mesh had built, those 3 broken ponds, or the decrepit tavern. If they decided not to cling to these, they would simply depart. Once the word was out, why couldn't they sleep anywhere out in the wilderness? Guerrilla warfare was nothing remarkable for a gang of bandits who lived off plunder. There weren't many mountains here, a few small woods but not many, yet most crucially, there were plenty of extensive urban ruins. These were even better suited for guerrilla warfare than any other kind of terrain. Take part in whatever business is available, strike when there's an opportunity for an ambush, and retreat into the city whenever a powerful enemy force approaches. I have no lair, no foundation. Are your armored forces going to come into the urban ruins to fight me? In the ruins, do armored forces have the agility, the speed of a person? However, before actually moving into the ruins or the forest, they still had to launch an ambush. After those officers from the new alliance had fled, Terrell realized that Major Prabuff's forces would surely come. Far from telling his troops to hurry and escape, he decided instead to stage an ambush along the way. Chapter 145. After receiving the telegram about Morgan and others escaping, Prabuff realized the road to Sanchi town would certainly not be peaceful. Nov. L.B//JNN. To be honest, he was somewhat annoyed. His troops had spent more than 2 days in Sanchi town and yet had failed to recognize it as a den of thieves. In hindsight, there were indeed some signs. But at that time, he was entirely focused on planning the subsequent operations, considering how many settlements could be taken over through intimidation, and where some military measures might be necessary. Put simply, he hadn't paid enough attention to Sanchi town, which had already been secured, and that led to this huge blunder. The escape of the 7 civil affairs officers was good news. The intelligence they brought back was also of great importance to him. In the wastelands, plunderers had always been a major problem. The reason why he decided to relocate all the population except the essential agricultural labor was not only because there was a significant shortage of manpower in Wuxing City, but also there was another major issue. As Gu Hang had previously mentioned to him, they lacked the capacity to manage those less valuable small settlements. Those places weren't entirely without value, but the input-output ratio was seriously unbalanced. If you wanted to run them, you would need to input a large amount of materials and support industries, which basically meant engaging in poverty alleviation work. Besides poverty alleviation, military forces had to be invested for protection. Otherwise, settlements that became even slightly wealthier would become targets for looters. Plunderers, monsters in the wild, these were all major threats in the wasteland. And now, in addition to consolidating various settlements, Prabhu's forces had another mission: bandit extermination. The 3 agricultural settlements that were left behind needed a stable environment to expand production. This region was also an important trade route from Wuxing City to Rubbish Town. Rubbish Town was a crucial source of raw materials for the industrial base of Wuxing City, and it also needed to ensure the security of this transportation route to import food. According to the governor, he wanted to see every power in this region fly the flag of the new alliance, and that included the plunderers' forces. Originally, Prabhu was unaware of the severity of the banditry in the area, and he had planned to settle the survivor settlements first before dealing with the bandit suppression. Now, it seems that action had to be taken ahead of schedule. Similarly, Prabhu could tell that those plunderers definitely didn't have the guts to confront him head-on, otherwise they would have attacked when he entered Sanchi town unguarded. But since they ultimately chose to rebel, they must have had something to rely on. Urban ruins, guerrilla warfare. Prabhu subsequently thought of these and made a judgment: he couldn't let this band of plunderers get away. A few thousand people dispersing and running into the pre-war ruins to then launch intermittent strikes at the trade routes would leave him with very few options to counter them. The entire bandit suppression operation would turn into a prolonged counter-guerrilla campaign. He almost immediately made a decision. All forces, attack immediately. To Sanchi town. Apart from his main force's swift and fierce advance, he also gave orders to several other deployed squads. Following his instructions, the 2 mechanized infantry companies that could move the fastest were to cut into the back of Sanchi town. The Strider V armored vehicles had exceptional off-road capabilities, allowing them to maintain a relatively good speed even off the road. The orders he gave to the 2 company commanders were to block Sanchi town's retreat routes. If the evacuation had already started, they were to attack immediately, delay their retreat, and wait for the main forces to arrive for an encirclement. The 2 motorized infantry companies advanced rapidly along the roads in 2 different directions, with trucks carrying soldiers charging toward Sanchi town from the connected routes. Prabhu himself led the headquarters along the main road towards Sanchi town, with the tank battalion and the artillery battalion possibly moving slower, but they were also the strongest units. And a day later, Prabhu's main force, still 2 days' march from Sanchi town, received 2 pieces of news. The fight had already begun at the front. The mechanized infantry companies he sent to cut off the rear arrived just in time. Each of them caught the tail of a retreating band of plunderers and launched an immediate attack. The enemy clearly had a lack of understanding of the mechanized troops' marching speed. The bandits, relying on foot travel and ox carts for transport, were caught completely off guard. The Strider V played an enormous role in the open field. The 40mm autocannons, firing without restraint, made it difficult for the plunderers to withstand. Even using ox carts and various goods as temporary cover, the grenade machine gun substituted for the twin machine guns on the armored vehicle's weapon station acted like a rapid-fire small grenade launcher, bombarding the enemy forces relentlessly. The dismounted infantry, following the armored vehicles and sweeping through the area, were mainly tasked with finishing off the survivors. The enemy had artillery. The caliber of those mountain guns wasn't large, but a few direct hits could potentially damage a few armored vehicles if they got unlucky. Unfortunately, those few mountain guns didn't even manage to set up a firing formation before they were destroyed by concentrated fire from the autocannons and grenade machine guns. Chapter 146. After these few mountain guns failed to make an impact, the only means they had left to threaten the armored personnel carriers were direct-fire rocket launchers. But these things, beyond 200 meters, were hard to aim accurately, and even when they hit, the power wasn't sufficient. To ensure both accuracy and enough power to threaten the Wanderer's side armor, one would have to get within a few dozen meters, and it would be best if 2 or 3 groups attacked at once. How difficult was this condition? Quite a few brave warriors tried to carry their rocket launchers closer, but in this open field with little cover, there was no chance to approach. The crew inside the Wanderer was equipped with a considerably sophisticated battlefield reconnaissance system, which could detect most threats through observation ports. Then came a round of machine gun fire or explosive shells, promptly blowing those brave ones daring to advance to pieces, along with the tubes in their hands. Nov. L. B //JNN. Even if there were blind spots in the armored personnel carrier's observation that allowed 1 or 2 rocket launcher teams to emerge, it was not a big deal. The soldiers who dismounted to fight on foot were for just this task. T5 level soldiers, no matter which military skill, all had sufficiently solid proficiency. You have a launcher, I have one too, plus more, the gun in my hand is more accurate than yours, with longer range and fiercer firepower. A few controlled shots or a preemptive rocket launch, and those raider fire teams that had managed to get close were wiped out. When the brave warriors daring to counterattack had mostly died, those left with less courage finally couldn't hold out any longer, and in complete collapse, they scattered. Then, like lambs awaiting slaughter in the wilderness, they were eliminated by soldiers wielding all sorts of weapons while fleeing. Actually, even if they all fought to the death, what could that have accomplished? Caught in a surprise attack by mechanized forces, without any position, without cover, lacking heavy weapons, out in the open field, they were just sitting ducks. Of course, there were many of them, and in the completely disordered rout, quite a few managed to escape. But without any transport, without supplies, it was uncertain how many of the raiders who fled would survive, how many could regroup and return. If the 2 mechanized infantry platoons responsible for the encirclement fought an exceedingly beautiful ambush and claimed a great victory, then the 2 motorized infantry platoons rushing towards Sanchi town along the roads had suffered a small loss, a sort of draw. These 2 platoons were a bit lacking in heavy weapons and heavy vehicles. The motorized infantry platoon only had the Iron Ox transport trucks and Scout Rider motorcycles. But the enemy they faced came prepared. The battle reports indicated that the raiders had clearly expected Prabhuv to lead his troops here. Along the way, they planted mines and bombs, they constructed roadblocks and positions along the roads, they set ambushes on both sides of the roads, ready to emerge and strike when the troops passed by. All these preparations had been effective. However, what they absolutely did not foresee was that the soldiers coming to fight would be of such elite caliber. During the advancement, a platoon led by Scout Rider motorcycles detected the enemy troops blocking the road ahead of time and relayed the information back. The platoon's scout squad also spotted the ambushes on both sides and immediately deployed from the trucks to meet the threat on both flanks. Bombs and mines along the road destroyed 2 trucks, but they did not cause further casualties, as the platoon's engineers began mine-clearing operations and constructed positions using the vehicles. These responses and reactions left the raiders, who were supposed to be the ambushers, somewhat dazed. This is not right. It wasn't the first time they had used similar tactics. The caravans they had ambushed before, even if protected by relatively strong mercenaries, would be disoriented after such an attack, and a complete rout was very possible. Even if they didn't scatter, it was already good if they could barely organize a defensive line relying on their baggage train, let alone have the spare capacity to counterattack the ambushers. And this counterattack was especially fierce. A single infantry squad dared to face over 100 enemies. Their tactical movements were standard and effective, crouching low, using the slight undulations of the terrain to conceal themselves. During fire exchange, their marksmanship was precise and surprisingly powerful. In contrast, sending an indiscriminate burst of gunfire from their side, whether they hit their mark or not was unknown, but certainly no one on the opposite side was falling. On the other hand, a few 3-shot bursts from the enemy and people on their side were getting killed. One infantry squad managed to hold back the attackers on one side, which was rather exaggerated. But what could be done? Surely over 100 men on their side couldn't truly be chased away by a mere dozen from the other side? After a brief regroup, they began a forceful assault. They intensified the firepower directly in front, while others were sent to infiltrate from the flanks. Who doesn't know how to infiltrate? The result was, the team responsible for infiltration ran right into another infantry squad. Next, the limited heavy firepower from the platoon and company came into play. At the convoy, hastily constructed mortar positions began to assert themselves, rocket launchers from the squads were drawn, loaded with high explosive ammunition, and as the raiders launched their attack, a single shot would explode and kill several. Chapter 147. They really couldn't break through. Then more soldiers flushed out from the positions built around vehicles and launched a countercharge in the direction of the two ambushing forces. The ambushing forces on both sides of the road, each numbering about 200 men, were actually overrun by this assault. However, these soldiers did not pursue too aggressively. After all, a gunfight between infantry in the open field still results in a certain level of casualties. There was simply no need for it. They retreated to their positions, allowing those looters who had started to fall back to come forward again. This was exactly what they hoped for. In battle, the efficiency of killing with guns is just too low. In fact, at the very start of the combat, they had already sent word to the rear. Upon receiving the message, the driver of the artillery support company, parked quite a distance away at the main camp, floored the accelerator. In less than half an hour, they had covered almost 20 kilometers. This was a somewhat risky decision. Moving the artillery battalion forward without protection was hazardous. The only defense they had was a few dozen soldiers from the guard, engineering, and logistics units, riding scout rider motorcycles for protection. But obviously, the looters who had never encountered heavy artillery didn't take that into account. The artillery support company, having advanced 20 kilometers, halted the Iron Bulls acting as tow trucks and quickly set up the towed howitzers. Using the coordinates relayed from the front line infantry, they adjusted their firing parameters. Then, the 10 gods of war before them began to roar. The 155 mm howitzers they deployed had a range that could reach nearly 25 kilometers. And there, that was exactly where the two motorized infantry companies at the front were engaging in combat. After entangling in battle with the ambushers in the front and on both sides for nearly an hour, they finally received support from friendly artillery. 12 heavy artillery shells fell about 200 to 300 meters outside their positions, covering a half circle. The looters were dumbfounded by the explosion. The 50-kilogram shells, standing half the height of a person, blasted craters 2 meters deep upon impact, with a lethal range nearly the size of a soccer field. Those near the blast center were obliterated, those a bit further away suffered from shattered organs due to the shockwave or were wounded by shrapnel. Without defensive fortifications or cover, this round of artillery fire resulted in extremely heavy losses for the ambushing looters. Besides the loss of personnel, an even heavier blow was to their morale. In the hour of combat preceding, they exerted themselves only to fail in vanquishing this group of soldiers, less than half their number, and even suffered a few counter-charges, losing men. With all the advantages on their side being prepared against the unprepared, resting against the weary, using terrain for ambush, outnumbering the enemy, they still ended up in a deadlock. This had already disheartened them. And with a round of heavy artillery pounding down, it further shattered their already low morale. The number of men killed in the hour-long fierce battle was probably fewer than those killed by this round of artillery fire. Immediately, looters whose morale had entirely collapsed began to flee, and the few who obeyed their leaders' orders to stay were soon met with a second round of artillery fire. After the deafening barrage of heavy artillery, not a single survivor dared continue the battle. What was the point of fighting if they couldn't win and just took bombs on the outskirts? But now, escaping was not so easy. Within the motorized infantry companies, there were indeed motorcycles. The scouts that had been pulled back inside the positions raced out with a sputtering sound. 2 men per vehicle, one driving, the other operating the machine gun mounted in the sidecar, began the pursuit. A large force of infantry followed closely, accompanied by the blare of the charge horn. How could the fleeing looters outrun the scouts with their superior off-road capability? Many were mowed down by the light machine guns on the motorcycles, and any attempt to stop and retaliate was met with a brief engagement from the scouts. The following infantry would instantly greet them with rocket launchers, then a dense shower of gunfire. The looters involved in this ambush and blocking battle suffered extremely heavy casualties, and less than 1 in 10 managed to escape the battlefield. 2 battles, 2 reports. The information reaching Prebuff's hands still served as a wake-up call. There was no doubt it was a great victory. In the 2 battlefields, at least 2,000 enemies were defeated. The number of dead and wounded was countless, with no time to tally, but certainly exceeding 1,000. Meanwhile, the 2 mechanized infantry companies had suffered fewer than double-digit casualties, the two motorized infantry companies fared slightly worse, with a combined total of about 30 casualties. With a casualty ratio of 150, what was there not to be satisfied with? Still, there were concerns. Prabhupada was summarizing the lessons learned. For instance, he should not have allowed the motorized infantry companies to advance too far ahead, leading to artillery support not being available until an hour into the battle. If that time frame could be moved up by half an hour, the casualties of the motorized infantry could perhaps be further reduced. Moreover, considering he had spread his forces quite thin, he also needed to consider how the main force of looters from Sanchi town would act next. After all, he was still unclear about the exact number of enemies, their arms and equipment, especially regarding heavy weapons. Chapter 148. If the enemy also has formidable heavy firepower and takes advantage of his current situation of having divided forces by launching a fierce attack on one of his units, what then? But on the other hand, this problem is unsolvable. If he were to gather his troops in one place, they might still be en route, and if the enemy were to launch an ambush during this time, even a small one, holding them off for just a few hours through progressive resistance, what if the main plunderer force in the rear got the message and seized the opportunity to scatter and escape? Conversely, the current situation is still relatively good. The motorized infantry company, with the help of artillery, broke through the enemy ambush and has entered the area before Sanchi town, where they are now constructing positions and laying siege. The mechanized infantry company is cruising behind, blocking the retreat. Looking at the four separate companies, they have locked down the four directions of Sanchi town, effectively trapping the gatherings of plunderers who were preparing to evacuate. As long as he can achieve another significant victory, a battle of annihilation, then coupled with the previous battle outcomes, at least 5,000 upward plunderers would have been dealt with. From Wuxing City to Rubbish Town, the route would essentially be cleared of plunderer bandits. Of course, there will inevitably be a small number of fish that slip through the net, but they will no longer pose any threat. How did the plunderers come to be? While some were born bad to the core, they are the minority. The majority of the plunderers are just ordinary people unable to make a living, who in desperation began to rob others of their chances to survive on this wasteland. Murder and theft, though reprehensible, becomes somewhat understandable upon deeper thought. And if the welfare policy for the 45 occupational classes being promoted by Lady Ozania in Revival City could successfully be extended to all the areas here, and if the majority of property-less poor people were relocated away, then the breeding ground for the plunderers in this area would be swiftly eradicated. Without a source, without more impoverished potential plunderers, these bandits would decrease with each one eliminated, negating the situation where the more you suppress them, the more they multiply. Sitting in the command vehicle, Prabhu thoroughly pondered the whole situation and ultimately decided to maintain the current method of divided encirclement and suppression. Despite the risks, from a purely military standpoint, this wouldn't be the preferred way to fight. There was a hint of waging a political war, but Prabhu remembered something the governor had said during a casual chat with the military officers: military actions are an extension of politics, and war is the most brutal and intense form of special violent political means. He was beginning to understand what that meant. Damn it! They're really looking down on us. We must teach them a harsh lesson. So what if they have armored vehicles and cannons? Does that make them so great? Inside Sanchi town, the leaders were holding a meeting. From Terrell down, emotions ran high, and everyone was yelling. Though they talked tough, in reality, each of them was panicking. How could they not panic? The original plan was to quickly evacuate once the army left, trying to take as much from their homes as possible. However, a traitor emerged, allowing several detained officials to escape. Then, sticking to the plan to continue the evacuation, they even decided to get a jump start by having some people take part of the supplies and leave first, while also setting up ambushes along the enemy's path, complete with landmines and roadside bombs. The result was that the enemy breached their ambush in just an hour, and most of those sent to participate in the ambush were killed or injured. The forces that left early with some supplies were ambushed by the enemy's mechanized troops from behind on the plains. The escorted supplies were completely lost, and of the 2,000 people, less than 400 made it back. One piece of bad news after another truly bewildered them. And what made them even dizzier was the combat strength exhibited by the new Alliance army. About 40 armored vehicles and fewer than 200 infantrymen crushed 10 times their number with almost no casualties. About 200 infantrymen formed a defensive position using trucks, stuck it out against nearly 1,000 men for an hour, and then everything was wiped clean after a round of artillery fire. How were they supposed to fight this? Indeed, their group of plunderers still had their main force untouched, and there were over 3,000 men in Sanchi town. But judging by the displayed combat power of the new alliance army, if all 3,000 men were thrown into battle, they would probably be swept away by several rounds of artillery fire and a charge by the armored forces. No one was willing to admit defeat, they only acted fierce with their words. Terrell had already attempted to muster a force to attack, but when it came to leading their own trusted troops out for a fight, nobody was willing. Amidst the clamor, Terrell finally lost his patience. He banged the table several times until everyone fell silent, then he spoke. "Are you done arguing?" Seeing the grim face of Terrell, the leading chief, no one dared to speak further. But in reality, many still held a disdainful attitude, and some even dared to openly display such feelings. How does a plunderer leader maintain his authority? It's nothing but battle honors. If you can lead your men to victory and indulge in feasting, then you're the toughest, regardless of whether you are known for loyalty or brutality. It's merely a matter of style. But if you lose, those who are known for loyalty get backstabbed, and those who rule with cruelty face rebellion. Chapter 149. He hadn't reached this level yet, but there were already signs of it. 2 devastating defeats, coupled with being cornered in Sanchi town and facing a deadlock, had greatly shaken his authority. He could even guess that there must be many people whose faith was wavering, who were already considering Baal's words. Would surrender be a better choice? Following the previous opportunity to join the new alliance army, would it not spare them from facing the sharp edge of blades? Even without privileges, being just an ordinary civilian was better than losing one's life. There were probably not a few people with this mindset, and all these thoughts would turn into resentment, falling onto him, the great leader. But there was still a way out. He had to find a way out for his brothers, then perhaps his authority had a chance of being maintained. Seeing that his action of slamming the table had silenced the crowd below, he felt somewhat relieved. His authority, built up over many years, had not completely vanished. He took a deep breath and began to outline his plan. Those governor's lapdogs, to put it plainly, are only about 800 strong, armed with fierce weapons, but they've spread their forces too thin in their attempt to surround us. If we concentrate our remaining cannons, all our explosives, in one place and strike with all our might, we're sure to break out. Someone jumped out with a dissenting view. The great leader makes it sound so easy. It's our men who will be going out to die. Another spoke up, talking about breaking out, who knows how many would die on the way. Bohr is right, we should have just been honest from the start. First there were scattered remarks, then the remaining crowd seemed eager to try, as if the whole meeting was on the verge of descending into a marketplace again. But the sound of gunfire cut off the brewing argument. The 3 who had just spoken each now had a bullet hole in their forehead. They fell backward with disbelieving faces. The shooter was Terrell. Everyone else was startled, their faces carrying a look of disbelief as if they never expected Terrell to dare to draw a gun and kill people in such a setting. All from outlaw backgrounds, some instinctively reached for their guns within moments. "Nobody move!" Terrell bellowed loudly. But at that moment, was shouting alone enough? There were still those continuing to reach for their guns. However, the many plunderers guarding nearby, as if prepared, raised their weapons and aimed at those who were stirring. These men were undoubtedly Terrell's confidants. With the present situation foreseen, Terrell was naturally prepared. These guards, already in position, targeted the agitating leaders and opened fire, but bullets don't discriminate, and stray shots hitting the innocent were all too common. Many fell and died, those not involved yet injured called out, some tried to resist, but in the end, they were all swept to the ground like the others before them. Quickly, all the plunderer leaders on one side of the meeting hall were shot dead. On the other side, there was little commotion. That side consisted of Terrell's staunch supporters, who even anticipated the current turn of events. Once the tumult subsided, Terrell stood up and cursed, "A bunch of ungrateful bastards." After finishing his tirade, he directed his supporters to take over and integrate the troops of those who had been killed. After making arrangements, he had someone bring in 2 wooden crates from outside. Upon opening them, green vials of medicine wrapped in straw were revealed. "Hand these out, and when it's time to break through, have the assault team drink them." The battle came even more suddenly than expected. Terrell, after clearing out the internal opposition, had almost exhausted all the authority he had accumulated over the years, managing to keep the tribes of the slain leaders under control as he took them over. Then, he struggled to mobilize the troops, hoping to rally the remaining 3,000 to nearly 4,000 people within Sanchi town to launch a full-scale breakout in the same direction. The heavy artillery the new Alliance army possessed was the weapon he feared the most. One shot from that thing, if the troops were a bit too clustered, meant dozens, even hundreds of casualties, yet the width of the battlefield for breaking out of the city would not be too large, and if one were determined to break through, ensuring enough force in the assault team meant troops couldn't spread out too much. However, that would significantly increase the lethality of the enemy's artillery. It was truly a dilemma. But a choice had to be made in the face of any dilemma. Terrell planned to order his troops to launch a desperate assault, rushing to fight at close quarters with the enemy, just tens of meters away, so they could engage in close combat. In this way, the distance between friend and foe was greatly reduced. The new Alliance army's heavy artillery would not be able to perform as well. They would have to be wary of causing friendly fire, as the enemy could not afford to take losses any more than they could. However, he somewhat underestimated the difficulty of reassembling his forces after the killings. Although he managed to avert outright mutiny and internal strife, the speed of regrouping the entire military force was far slower than expected. Before he was ready to lead his forces in the breakout, the new Alliance army launched an attack first. Chapter 150. At the start of the attack, the plunderers in Sanchi town were already a little stunned. Even Terrell, when he bravely ascended a high platform to observe the battle, was somewhat dazed. It was unquestionable that the heavy artillery fired first. Around the edges of Sanchi town, and then at the buildings, followed by the plunderers who had dug trenches, were too scared to stick their heads out under the bombardment. If it weren't for the leaders exerting pressure, nobody would have dared to run, and it's possible that this artillery barrage alone could have totally shattered the outer defenses. The plunderers hiding in fortifications, bunkers, and trenches actually suffered relatively few casualties. If they weren't hit directly by a shell, or too close to the blast to be killed or injured by the shock wave, the deadly and terrifying shrapnel couldn't penetrate their cover to cause harm. After all, they wouldn't die as miserably as those unlucky ones who had been defending in the open field. Being bombed there was truly horrific. However, the ear-splitting roar of the cannons and the terrifying force that made the earth tremble filled people with fear and horror. It seemed the enemy's artillery must have been more than 20 kilometers away. Even if they wanted to retaliate, they couldn't see a thing. They could try to calculate the enemy's artillery position based on the trajectory of the shells, but it was useless. They did have cannons of their own, but those small caliber, assorted mountain guns could barely maintain accuracy beyond 10 kilometers, let alone affect the heavy artillery positions 20 kilometers away. Their only option was to shrink back and bear the bombardment. But if that had been all, it would still have been within Terrell's expectations. However, following this round of artillery fire, he could see that the Alliance army had launched a full-fledged offensive. Just after the shelling, maybe just 200 meters from the blast site, the infantry of the Alliance army had already appeared. The mortar teams also showed their might, unleashing a round of shelling toward the front. The soldiers were rapidly charging forward. Before the warmth of the artillery barrage had even dissipated, they had already rushed into the position that had just been shelled. The stunned plunderers, with the wounded getting finished off by rifle fire, and those lucky enough to be unharmed, were too scatterbrained to put up any effective defense and were quickly and messily eliminated. But of course, there wasn't just one layer of defenses. Aside from the locations that were bombed, there were still other plunderers present behind them. If they had shown themselves and started shooting at this moment, they could certainly have posed a threat to the attacking soldiers. But they didn't, as another round of artillery had already covered their position. The most terrifying thing was that the infantry of the Alliance army were only about 200 meters from the blast site. The lethal range of those fearsome heavy cannons was nearly 100 meters. Weren't they afraid that if a shell were to fall just a bit off course, it might land on their own men? The gunners weren't afraid, the commanders weren't afraid. Weren't those frontline infantry afraid? Terrell had never seen anything like this before. A few terms he had only heard of but never witnessed crossed his mind: combined arms operation, creeping barrage. He knew that the outer defenses he had spent so much time building were now doomed. But Terrell quickly realized that he couldn't really let the outer defenses be destroyed. Otherwise, once the Alliance army broke through, without the town's edge fortifications and trenches, the battle would become even more difficult. That area was intended to be his launch point for a breakout operation from behind. Terrell, gritting his teeth, issued orders to the troops behind him to open fire with their own artillery. The much smaller caliber mountain guns, even if they couldn't reach the Alliance army's artillery in the rear, at least had to threaten the enemies right in front of them, making them taste the artillery fire as well. Moreover, under his command, more plunderers counterattacked in the direction of the Alliance army's advance. He didn't want this, but the situation changed too fast, and there was no time to slowly organize troops and find a breakout direction. If they truly had to fight a breakout battle, then they needed to crush the enemies before them and they could potentially kill their way out. However, just as he had ordered a large number of his own troops to fill into the first line of defense and engage in close-range firefight with those new Alliance soldiers, two new developments occurred. First, the artillery barrage they had just fired 2 rounds of, was finished. He had ordered his own artillerymen to fire and then move positions after each shot. Nevertheless, the narrow spaces within Sanchi town made it difficult for the artillery to maneuver, and relocation was even tougher. Moreover, although their cannons were light, they lacked towing vehicles, and relying on manpower to push meant the speed of movement was not at all guaranteed. As a result, they were caught in the act. Their artillery could not reach the Alliance army's artillery formation, yet the enemy's heavy cannons undoubtedly brought their cannons within their firing range. After 2 rounds of bombardment, the raiders' artillery positions were no more. Not only were there heavy casualties among the gunners, but a large number of the cannons were destroyed or damaged as well. Of course, once the Alliance's artillery had focused its firepower on the town's artillery, there was no way to provide cover for the soldiers fighting at the front. Although the attacking infantry still had some mortars available to them, these were nowhere near as powerful as the 155 mm howitzers. This slowed the pace of those soldiers trying to break through the outer defenses, but the raiders who continued to push forward actually succeeded in pulling the combat range to within 100 meters. At this distance, the effectiveness of firearms greatly increased, and it became difficult for the Alliance's heavy artillery to cover this area. Even if the Alliance's gunners were accurate and their soldiers fearless, friendly fire from artillery was a real concern. Hesitant to risk hitting their own, of course they couldn't continue to recklessly bombard an area where both sides were intermingled in close combat. However, just as he started to comfort himself with this thought, Terrell saw another scene that sent a chill through his limbs. The Alliance's tank platoon had advanced. A total of 12 tanks stirred up clouds of dust on the dirt roads. Their 76 mm smoothbore guns began to assert their dominance. Knowing they wouldn't be facing any armored targets, all the tanks were loaded with high-explosive fragmentation shells. A dozen guns fired in unison, and at a range of just a few hundred meters, not even a kilometer, they began to strike at the raiders' newly formed counterattack posture. The raiders appeared to have no answer to these steel beasts. And taking advantage of the tanks' suppressive fire, the infantry began to surge forward. They specifically targeted raider fire teams trying to threaten the tanks. As for places firmly held by the enemy, such as scatter pits and temporary positions built from building debris, there wasn't much to discuss. Just call for the tankers to fire a couple of shots, or even sweep through with coaxial machine guns, and it was all over. The tanks' tracks rolled over trenches, moving closer and coordinating with the infantry in combat. The raiders' counterattack was directly destroyed, and those who dared to close in for hand-to-hand combat all learned of the power of tank cannons and coaxial machine guns, suffering heavy casualties as a result. Seeing this scene, Terrell finally lost his composure. Frantically grabbing the field radio, he shouted, "Drink all those combat drugs! Drink! Fight them with everything! If we can't win, there's no way out!" After finishing, he took several deep breaths, then shook his whole body as if realizing something, and hurriedly left the command post. Immediately afterward, his closest and most trusted squad, protecting him, headed out of Sanchi town in another direction. He was running away. Chapter 151. Prabhuff, as the commander, rode in the listener command vehicle, not far from the front line. The enemy didn't possess much in the way of long-range firepower, so he wasn't too worried. The overall progress of the battle had not surprised him. The lines formed by the marauders, under the coordination of infantry and artillery, were quickly broken. The troops that were deployed later also suffered a heavy blow under the cooperation of the infantry and tanks. Despite the enemy outnumbering his men by far, the battle at this stage was not about manpower, it was about firepower. Compared to firepower, these marauders stood no chance against his newly formed composite camp. Merely 2 dismounted mechanized infantry platoons, with the support of the artillery support platoon and the tank platoon, had routed the marauders head-on. The defensive line pierced with a poke, the counterattack shattered with a touch, such was the true portrayal of these marauders. The battle was won, with no suspense remaining. What was left to do was to expand the victory. Of course, Prabhupada hadn't forgotten that his mission was not just to defeat this group of enemy forces. He needed to fight an exemplary annihilation battle and utterly eradicate these bandits that threatened the trade routes and surrounding settlements. Killing everyone or capturing the vast majority were both options. If they were dead, there would be no more thieves. For those who didn't die, picking out some who had committed heinous crimes and executing them, then sentencing the rest to 5 or 10 years of hard labor, to be sent to work as miners in the abandoned cave society or to chop trees in the alien forest to make building materials or raw materials for synthetic starch, were all possible options. And to truly expand the victory, the 2 mechanized infantry platoons that were cruising in another direction had also received orders and began their assaults. Truth be told, the most formidable forces within his composite camp were these 2 mechanized infantry platoons, not the tank platoon. The Challenger tanks that were captured were merely domestic products, imported from a heavy industrial conglomerate named Blackbird, located to the west. Blackbird Heavy Industries was reportedly once part of the Alliance, a heavy industrial center established during the era of the first governor with the help of the Empire, situated a bit further west than the Western Desert. However, during the time of the second governor, they had essentially become detached from the Alliance, and now apart from trade, there was little interaction, with the Alliance's orders being as good as farts in the wind. As a result, the 70 tanks among the old Alliance Legion were relics from a very long time ago, probably all having a service life of at least a decade. Compared to the Strider V armored infantry fighting vehicles, which were widely equipped among the Star Realm Army's main forces, except for the tank cannon, they were utterly useless. In terms of armor, it's true the armored vehicles had thinner skin and filling compared to the Challenger tanks, and their armor plates were much thinner, but they managed to maintain better defensive capabilities despite the thinness. How does one even argue with that? As for mobility, with exceptional off-road performance, whether Strider V was climbing hills or traversing muddy fields, everything was manageable, it was just a matter of speed. The Challenger tanks, on the other hand, had to move on flat terrain, or they could get bogged down at any moment in difficult ground. And when it came to speed, the tanks were no match for the armored vehicles. Even if we talked about firepower, indeed, the 40mm twin-barreled autocannon was not as fierce as the 76mm smoothbore gun, but its much faster rate of fire made it a superior support weapon for infantry. Once those 2 mechanized infantry platoons launched their attacks, the marauders were even less able to make a splash. The defenses they had set up were blown to pieces by the autocannon and grenade machine guns, and the dismounted infantry squads that followed swiftly captured one position after another. They advanced quickly, and after poking through the rear end of Sanchi town, they cut towards the back of the main battlefield. Logically speaking, things should not have gone so smoothly. Having fought a few battles with these marauders, they shouldn't have become so incapable. When their rear was attacked, they should have taken some countermeasures, though the outcome was already determined. At the very least, they should have caused some trouble for the 2 assaulting mechanized infantry platoons to look credible. But that didn't happen. The marauders seemed to have lost command, appearing rigid, ossified, and chaotic. Prabhupada was somewhat baffled. I don't have any elite special forces or anything to carry out beheading operations, nor to cut off command communications. Why have these people become like this? But soon, he figured out the key. Could it be that the enemy chieftain has already fled? It was very likely indeed. Expecting the leaders of these marauders to fight to the death was hardly realistic. Moreover, connecting it to what Morgan's people had previously suggested that they pretended to surrender but then rebelled largely because their leader coerced the group with his own selfish desires, the lower-level marauders would not resist if given a chance for a stable life, would they? Having realized this, he had an idea. He ordered the camp headquarters to move forward, including the several communication vehicles. Soon after, the loudspeakers of the army started to blare. Your leader has fled. Lay down your weapons, surrender and you will not be killed. 2 short sentences kept transmitting through the loudspeakers to the ears of the resting marauders, interspersed with intense artillery fire, and what they saw before their eyes were dozens of steel behemoths. Chapter 152. They truly couldn't hold out any longer. Moreover, the statement "the leader has escaped" might actually be true. Many middle-ranking leaders had indeed not received any directives from Terrell, the supreme leader from the rear, for a long time. Even when they tried to inquire back, there was no news. Battlefield communications had been jammed by the listener who had advanced to the front, leaving only static on the radios. Those who were sent back to ask in person either never returned, leaving it unclear whether they were dead or had deserted, or they came back as clueless as headless flies, having found nothing. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that there would be a widespread occurrence of leaders from all levels surrendering, starting with the Marauder tribe. The battle should be nearly over by now. However, Prabhupada soon received news that wiped the smile from his face. He received intelligence from the front line that the soldiers had seen dozens of green skin orcs on the battlefield. He immediately thought of the Marauder tribe named Prisoner of War, the one that nearly annihilated them around the Podong Society. During that battle, he was not enlisted and had not seen it with his own eyes. But he had studied the compiled materials on it. He had also heard some details during his exchanges with Captain Yan Fangxiu, who was now a colonel. If those kinds of greenskin orcs, especially in such numbers, had indeed appeared, they'd be in big trouble. Those monsters were such that ordinary rifles and even machine guns in the hands of regular soldiers could hardly inflict effective damage. It was said that the squad of the governor's bodyguards killed the one outside Podong Society with more powerful electromagnetic rifles, and the governor himself even took part. His soldiers did not have such powerful individual weapons at their disposal. Given the firepower the soldiers had, it would probably take bazookas, armored vehicle-mounted machine guns, and grenade launchers to inflict actual, effective damage. Yet those monsters possessed immense destructive power, capable of tearing human bodies apart with their hands. Not to mention, they might also have some kind of powerful individual firearms. Prabhupada immediately prepared to order the frontline soldiers to not engage these enemies head-on, but to seek nearby Strider infantry fighting vehicles and rely on the vehicles' firepower for combat. If none were nearby, they were to rely on fire support teams and use individual rocket launchers to eliminate the enemy. At the same time, he was mentally prepared for the troops to suffer a significant number of casualties. Just when we're on the verge of a great victory, we encounter such an unexpected problem. He cursed inwardly. If they had prior intelligence and were prepared, it might have been better. But to suddenly encounter this kind of enemy during the pursuit of victory, while expanding the battle results or even while conscripting the enemy, casualties were almost unavoidable. However, while he was worrying, new frontline battle reports came in. After hearing the report, he finally let out a sigh of relief. It was good news. On one hand, the enemy was also quite unprepared when those greenskin orcs appeared, mainly within the ranks of the marauders. It seemed they had no real control over those creatures, who attacked all the humans indiscriminately once they appeared. As a result, the marauders themselves bore the brunt of the casualties. The other piece of good news was that those greenskin orcs were far from being as formidable as Prabhupada had remembered. Although their ability to withstand injury was indeed exaggerated, they were not completely immune to conventional firearms. After taking dozens of bullets, they could still be killed. Most importantly, they had little intelligence, often charging out recklessly. The firearms they used belonged to the marauders themselves and were of average power. In that period, there had indeed been many casualties reported, with even entire squads being wiped out. But at the same time, a large number of greenskin orcs were also killed. Especially after the infantry fighting vehicles entered the fray, performing dedicated sweeping tasks, the situation had stabilized once more. Half an hour later, the main battlefield had quieted down completely. The greenskin orcs had been wiped out, and most of the remaining marauders had surrendered, with only a few scattered individuals fleeing. Hunter motorcycles and some infantry fighting vehicles had already set out, beginning the pursuit operations in the plains area. The pursuit was estimated to last for a day or two. Very likely, less than 100 of the marauders would manage to escape with their lives. After the basic fight was considered over, Prabhupada personally went to the front lines and saw the bodies of those greenskin orcs. No more, no less, a total of 80. Their appearance had resulted in about 27 soldiers' casualties. Prabhupada sighed deeply. He was pained by the loss of his soldiers but also understood the principle that compassion did not lead an army. In the end, he could only order. Burn the bodies of these greenskin creatures. Make sure they are burned completely. You have gained an upper hand, received 347 points of grace. Losses, 154, kills, 2,772, captures, 2,468. 1st Calming Wind Brigade, 1st Composite Battalion losses, 154, kills, 2,772. Only after the pursuit was entirely over did Guhang receive the belated battle statistics in the system. By that time, Prabhu's battle report had already arrived first. The casualties and number of prisoners matched, but there was a slight difference in the number of kills. After all, Prabhu had to clear the battlefield, using prisoner interrogations and body counts to confirm the specific results. Some of the missing and unaccounted for, those whose bodies couldn't be pieced together after being shelled, buried beneath the rubble and not dug out in time. Chapter 153. In various situations, discrepancies between the numbers and the system's outputs are normal. The profit from this wave of bounty was quite good, but comparatively speaking, Gu Hang cared more about the green skin orcs mentioned in the intelligence. If he allowed this cancer of the universe to develop on Rage Owl Star, then they'd truly be doomed. This race is legitimately capable of sparking wars sweeping across multiple star systems. In fact, when Gu Hang encountered a human outside the abandoned cave society who could turn into a green skin after taking some medicine, he already became vigilant. However, given the mere few hundred guns and the not-so-strong base he had at that time, he really didn't have the strength to tackle that problem first. But now, he felt that this issue couldn't be delayed any longer. Moreover, according to recent developments, it seemed that the greenskins might be on the path to further strengthening their presence. This was corroborated by two pieces of intelligence. First, was the incident encountered by Perbuff. Second, came from Rubbish Town. Gu Hang had long made arrangements in Rubbish Town, an important source of raw materials. Denison Henry continued to import large quantities of decent quality munitions and bulletproof vests from the abandoned cave district to Rubbish Town, as well as managing the trade route of alloy plastic steel to Revival City and then buying food from Revival City back to Rubbish Town. This trade had made a lot of money in recent months. Although that trade route stopped for a few days due to war and disasters, it was quickly restored after the war. He even took up a consultant position in the new Alliance Ministry of Commerce, specifically responsible for raw material imports and finished goods sales. And he was recently stepping up the purchase of munitions. The weapons to be phased out left by the old Alliance Legion hadn't been shipped to Green Valley based on Ozania's military aid plan too much before a lot were already sold to Rubbish Town. Why did Rubbish Town suddenly need so many weapons and excellent bulletproof vests? They even wanted the originally very sturdy plastic steel bulletproof plates, which normal bullets could hardly penetrate after many shots, to be further strengthened and thickened. It was to combat the greenskins. The number of greenskins in the high tower ruins had increased significantly this year, seriously threatening the survival of Rubbish Town, which collected scrap materials from the ruins. This matter could not be ignored anymore. Tomorrow, Henry Denison would come to Revival City, and Gu Hang would meet with him in person to decide what to do about Rubbish Town's affairs. It was actually the largest settlement in the direction that Perbuff's camp had raided. There are 3 continents on Rage Owl Star, not to mention the other 2 that once had psychic energy fields abundant with spiritual energy. Those were the main battlegrounds of the apocalyptic war 100 years ago and were the most thoroughly destroyed. They can essentially be regarded as desolate wastelands with low-energy storms enveloping them daily. The main continent they were currently on could roughly be divided into 6 regions. With Revival City at the center, the region within 1,000 kilometers to the south, north, east, and west is conventionally considered the central region, which used to be directly governed by the Alliance government at its height. About 5 million people live here, with 1 million in Revival City alone. Nearly 2,000 kilometers east from the eastern border of the central region lies the Tower Cluster region. This was where the most prosperous metropolitan areas were located before the war, with a multitude of super-cities densely packed together, connected by a developed network of highways. Of course, now the Tower Cluster region is nothing but super-large urban ruins. The population eking out a living in these urban ruins is estimated to be around 5 million, only a ballpark figure. 5 to 600 kilometers south of the central region, or 1,000 kilometers south along the eastern coastline from the Tower Cluster region, is a noticeably converging peninsula, surrounded by sea on 3 sides, known as the Green Valley region. This name has been passed down from before the war and is the area on the entire continent that was least ravaged by the war. It used to be an agricultural area, home to about 15 million people. Going 600 kilometers north from the central region and entering the cold region, that area was once an industrial hub, now a mix of ruins and wilderness with the least population, about 3 million. 5 to 600 kilometers west from the central region lies the 2,000 kilometer stretch of the West Desert region. The people there survive on sparse oases and the vertical agricultural bases underneath them from before the war, with a population of around 5 million, yet the food production is considerable and the export voluminous. Past the West Desert region to the west is the heavy industry area that was also an industrial center in the past, or it could be simply said that the heavy industry of the cold region spread from there. There is a significant force, the Blackbird heavy industries, that wholeheartedly supported the rise of the first-generation governor but quickly turned against the alliance during the second generation, even reaching the point of waging a battle across the West Desert region. Most of the grain exported from the West Desert region is sent westward to the heavy industry area. This is the overall layout of the main continent of Rage Owl Star. Gu Heng's current plan is to take control of the entire central region of the main continent with Revival City at its core, sort out these 5 million people, and then opportunistically expand eastward and southward, especially focusing on Green Valley region with its large population, which is of paramount importance. He set a half-year target to control the central region, seizing Green Valley region and Tower Cluster region needed to be completed within half a year. In doing so, he would command a population exceeding 20 million and control crucial food production bases and industrial raw material bases. Coupled with the black box technology from the system in Revival City and Wixing City, after a year's development, taxation would now become tangible. After all, the privilege he'd been granted was that for the first tax collection, he needed to pay only a quarter of the standard amount. Of course, that was the minimum guarantee. In actuality, historically, people from the West Desert region, heavy industry area, and cold region would also bring their due taxes during the collection period, though far from the full amount. But if they paid something, it meant less production pressure for Gu Heng's region, allowing retention of a bit more in hand. And once past the first tax collection hurdle, with 2 more years' time, he could further plan for 2 years to gain global control, so as to face the first full tax collection 4 years later. According to this timeline, his expansion plan could not stop. Rubbish Town was a place that needed to be taken over soon without delay. Chapter 154. Before meeting Denison Henry, Gu Heng had some time to do another thing. A Terra Standard month had passed since the last fixed income distribution. It was time for the system to pay out salaries again. Last time, when salaries were paid, he only controlled 2 campgrounds that could not yet be called Wixing City. By continuously shearing sheep from Revival City, he managed to just barely reach a population of around 10,000 before the month's settlement, pushing the fixed income slightly over 50 points. In contrast, he now had control over a population of 1 million. After acquiring Revival City, various debuffs attached to the city's status caused its million population to provide him with a reduced fixed income of just over 60 points. When he first saw this, Gu Heng was almost shocked senseless, quite dissatisfied with the situation. But upon further consideration, those debuffs weren't imposed by an external force, they were genuine issues that emerged right after he took the city. In the half-month since, he had instructed Ozania and Lambert to do many things in the city. Even though they had gone through a near-disastrous storm that almost destroyed the whole city, everything had at least returned to the right track of reconstruction by now. And many debuffs were indeed eliminated through their efforts. City standstill, anarchy, post-war chaos, rebellious elements, not limited to those mentioned, many similar terms that described how bad the city's situation had been disappeared. There were still issues like starving city, lower-level chaos, administrative disorder, trade disruption, that hadn't been completely resolved, but they were downgraded to food shortage, lack of basic-level management personnel, insufficient administrative efforts, obstructed trade routes, implying that although problems persisted, they had been alleviated. Of course, there were still quite a few unresolved, such as extremely low living standards of the citizens, poor infrastructure, low population quality, altogether more than 10 negative statuses. There was even widespread damage, a new debuff. But overall, it was still much better than before. This could be directly seen from the numbers. Revival City's monthly fixed income had increased from just over 60 to 211. On the other side, Wixing City experienced even more growth. Initially only surpassing 50 by a small margin, now, with the continuous migration of 100,000 people from Revival City, and Perbuff's efforts bringing in nearly 20,000 people to Wixing City, it gathered a population of 130,000, most of whom were potential industrial workers. Automotive, military, and pharmaceutical industries were all expanding vigorously with enough people to support them. Even though many of the population had not yet been integrated and many could not be considered qualified industrial workers, needing sufficient training and learning, the current monthly gross income had still surged to 187. Combined, the total was 398. The salary could be described as having skyrocketed. More importantly, this was obviously not the limit. With the urban reconstruction and production plans of both cities gradually being completed, with the implementations and advancements in place, whether it was eliminating negative city statuses or the tangible monthly grace income increases brought about by actual production capacity improvements, these were foreseeable. With uninterrupted development momentum, this number could continue to soar at a considerable rate. And just the income of this current month, added with the battle per buff fought, along with previous leftovers, Gu Heng now had a whopping 889 grace points on hand. He had to spend it. Grace points wouldn't earn interest by being hoarded, spending them could truly enhance the territories under his command. Where to spend it used to be a question. Continuing to invest in the technology interface was certainly good. So far, nearly every technology he acquired had brought substantial benefits to Gu Heng. They either became an important industry within his territories or an essential resource referring to the reactor. Without that power plant generating electricity from the reactor, heavy industry wouldn't know how much coal to consume for energy. However, the training of industrial workers was a big problem. Many of the technological methods drawn out had yet to be digested. Moreover, as more items were produced on the technology interface, the probability of winning within that tier would decay, forcing one to draw from a higher tier, making Gu Heng somewhat reluctant to throw all his current grace points into it. He first took out 134 grace points to train troops. The newly formed 2-division level brigade units had their soldiers mostly in place. The majority of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade's personnel came from the old Alliance Legion. Those soldiers had some military training but obviously fell short of a higher standard. Perhaps for someone like Yan Fangxiu, who came from a formal military officer background, if you just fed and housed them well and had them do nothing else but train for 2 or 3 years and then go through 1 or 2 intense battles, they could indeed become T5 level soldiers and officers. But obviously, Gu Heng couldn't wait that long. The newly conscripted regiment of about 7,000 people, constituting 3 battalions of infantry, was under the same logic. Adding them all up amounted to just over 13,000 people. Calculating the cost, the 134 grace points were spent. Chapter 155. This allocation of grace points would give his 2-division and brigade level units considerable combat strength. Whether speaking of the military skills and quality of the soldiers, or in terms of their weaponry and equipment, this was the case. Even that infantry division, which might look shabby, was only so in comparison to the Wind Extinguishing Brigade. If you just look at them, each soldier is equipped with a complete G9 set, which includes alloy steel bulletproof plates, the squad's machine guns, the platoon's mortars, the company's Ranger Rapid Reconnaissance Squad, the battalion's artillery battery. They had everything that was needed. Still benchmarking against the Empire's main Star Realm army, an ordinary 3rd or 4th tier force, what's so-called a line-filling division, would only be at this level. On Rage Owl Star, it would be quite rare for any power to be able to field an infantry division with soldiers of such qualified caliber and properly equipped. After these predetermined grace points were spent, Gu Heng still had 755 points in hand. And these grace points had a new destination. Because as his monthly fixed income surged past 300, a new interface appeared on the system panel. Architectural System. Upon opening it, Gu Heng saw a very long drop-down menu, densely packed with rows of icons in black, followed by text descriptions that were simply marked with a question mark. These buildings. Clearly, these were in an unlocked state. At the very top were 5 unlocked ones, which were the Technical Academy, Comprehensive Academy, Loyal Air Academy, Military Factory and Civilian Factory respectively. The first 3 were quite similar, to take the Technical Academy as an example. Technical Academy I. When you have built a school that imparts mechanical technology and put it into operation, you can exchange this option to grant it to the specified academy. It slightly increases student learning efficiency and weakly increases the likelihood of activating tech talent. Exchange value, 500 grace. The Comprehensive Academy had the same effect, but it just replaced the mechanical technology description with a comprehensive one, and the increase in learning efficiency was slight, yet the grace points spent shot up to 1,000. The Loyal Air Academy, however, had a significantly different feature, with the main difference being that it didn't teach knowledge, but loyalty instead. The main focus was on loyalty to the Empire, but Gu Heng could add a little something extra, forcibly binding loyalty to the Empire with personal loyalty to himself, something he had deliberately done in the past. In addition, the Loyal Air Academy had an extra functionality. It offered a new troop training option. Beyond the original 5 levels of T1-T5, there would be a T3 variant provided, the training option for company political commissars. The required unit needed to study at the Loyal Air Academy for a week to complete the training. The price was 10 grace points per person. This price was 10 times more expensive than ordinary T3 troops, but Gu Heng thought it was very valuable. He didn't need to train a bunch of company political commissars to form an army for combat, that would be crazy. This was clearly a way for him to quickly train sufficiently loyal soldiers and send them into various basic level units, serving as his firm means of controlling the military and ensuring discipline, morale, and combat effectiveness in battle. They might not have excellent command abilities, and their combat capabilities might be at the T3 level just because of a more steadfast will, but their most important role was to inspire their comrades and resolutely hold their ground to the death. He was now eager to get the Loyal Air Academy built as soon as possible and then have over 100 commissars of all levels go through a concentrated week of training before coming out. Moreover, Gu Heng came up with another idea from this. One difficulty in the rebuild plan he had previously thought about for the Phoenix Battle Group was how to find absolutely loyal youths to cultivate from a young age. The Loyal Air Academy seemed to be just the ticket. Adopting orphans or children of clear origins from a young age and nurturing them, then spending some grace to turn them into political commissars, thoroughly re-educate them ideologically, and then advance them all the way to T1 level to become elites, before going through with genetic seed surgery and implantation. Plan approved. Now, all that's missing is a channel to purchase, or even manufacture, power armor. To do the former, one would have to find a manufacturing world with the capability to produce power armor. Generally, such worlds are closely associated with the Mechanical Cult Guild. Gu Heng doesn't have the connections in this area, nor does he have any means of keeping the purchase of power armor a secret. As for the latter, it is unclear what level of technology the Star Realm Warrior's power armor belongs to, and even less clear when time could be afforded to work it out. But problems are always solved one by one. Haven't we already found a solution to the staffing issue? There must be a way when we come to the mountain. As for the two remaining buildings, the civilian and military factories, the situation is similar. Civilian Factory I, when you have built a civilian factory and put it into operation, you can redeem this option, and the designated factory will receive a moderate increase in production efficiency. Redemption price, 100 favor. The military factory is the same, with the same price, but the description changes to military specific. From seeing the different effects but similar descriptions of the architectural system options, one can roughly understand the mechanism. It's not that the system constructs a building out of thin air. The building, even the interior facilities, and the accompanied staff, all need to be managed by Gu Heng himself. The architectural system simply provides some bonuses. It's like a bonus card, which you apply to the appropriate factories or schools. Currently, only these two types have been unlocked. Moreover, among the options currently available in the architectural system, all bear an I, which suggests that there might be level 2, level 3, or even higher levels in the future. Beyond bonuses for the building itself, there might also be things similar to the Loyal Air Academy, which could bring about changes to the system's own functionality. The Loyal Air Academy can provide him with a new type of troop. Could other buildings do the same? For example, a level 1 technical academy only has a bonus effect, but as it levels up, could it eventually produce special troop types? He remembers that within the Mechanical Cult Guild, there is a dedicated protection army. They are not the castrated version of the imperial state religion. They are a legitimate military force. Among them, the most famous is the Titan Legion. Those towering, mecha-like war machines are incredibly fierce. A single one could sway the outcome of a battle. In the future, even if Gu Heng had the capability to manufacture such top-tier war machines, he would still need people who could pilot them, right? Even if it's just for now, Gu Heng is quite interested in the entire architectural system, especially the Loyal Air Academy. Unfortunately, with a redemption price of 1,000 points, it's a bit too expensive for him to afford at the moment. As for both the civilian and military factories, he could afford to exchange for them, but there's no need to do so now. Industrial workers, technology absorption. The means to boost his own production capacity have yet to be fully sorted out, and there's still a significant room for improvement in overall production efficiency. Therefore, it's not pressing to use the system's functions to spend favor points to increase production efficiency, which would be getting the priorities wrong. Under these circumstances, he really did consider keeping the 755 favor points he had on hand for now. Don't spend them. Wait for the next allotment of favor points to arrive, save up 1,000, and then go for the Loyal Air Academy first to give it a try. Not only can the political commissars of the army units be directly trained through the system, but the ideological education function of the Loyal Air Academy itself is also very important. In the future, all civil servants, administrative officials, military officers, and even as the scale expands, factory managers, business owners, merchants, and even the most ordinary industrial workers, could take some time each year to study there. In terms of policy, it would also be possible to define the experience and duration of study at the Loyal Air Academy as bonus points or even a requirement for promotion through the 45 ranks. Loyalty is the primary concern. Chapter 156. The construction of schools was entrusted to Ozania by Gu Heng, who specifically instructed her to set up the frameworks of the 3 academies first. Ozania felt somewhat puzzled. According to previous discussions, their primary focus in education should have been adult education, which included literacy campaigns and basic worker training to facilitate factory work. In addition to 4 to 6 years of compulsory general education for children and teenagers. This was a very pragmatic approach. Isn't education supposed to cost money? Adult education aimed to train individuals for short-term roles so they could quickly adapt to their positions. Even if the training was somewhat perfunctory, it was still better than having manpower that couldn't be utilized effectively. Education for children and teenagers, on the other hand, was focused on building for the future, as well as a reluctance to employ child labor which both compromised future potential and offered low productivity. However, in terms of education, besides the students being dedicated full-time, a substantial number of full-time teachers are also required. All of these individuals would need governmental financial support, all costing money. As for school buildings, that was an easier matter. It was only a few buildings, and planning a specialized construction area during Revival City's large-scale development wasn't a difficult task at all. But according to the governor's current statements, these 3 academies each qualified as institutions of higher education. Nov. L.B//JNN. How long has it been since Rage Owl Star had such schools? Intellectuals in the wasteland, at least those Ozania had seen, mostly pursued private education, small-scale elite training involving private tutors, education from elders, and families with substantial assets. She herself was somewhat of that sort. Higher education? It wasn't that it was a bad idea, but wasn't it a bit premature? Not to mention the difficulty of finding enough qualified teachers. The comprehensive academy might be manageable, and Loyal Air Academy could rely on reassigning military personnel, even unabashedly asking for help from the Phoenix, or even sending people to the Phoenix Monastery for advanced training. But what about the Technical Academy? Among the forces under the governor, Wu Jiarong was the only one who could truly be considered a superior technician. The rest, her students, were merely ordinary junior specialists and could not assume the responsibilities of a teacher. The same was true for Comprehensive Academy. Was it really feasible to have local intellectuals who were brought up on so-called elite education and family education take on teaching? It wasn't impossible, but they would have to be carefully screened for suitability and undergo retraining at Loyal Air Academy first. She presented these concerns to the governor, and Gu Heng didn't insist on her implementing the plans without question but instead provided an explanation. Of course, the explanation wasn't about revealing some system or something of the sort. It's not that we have to put it to use right now. I am aware of the issues you mentioned. However, we need to start by putting the framework in place. Even if the content taught isn't good enough yet, it will at least provide a destination for teenagers who have completed their compulsory education and for those with potential who are eager to further their studies. It's correct to do things step by step, but we must also initiate the process, he said. I understand, she replied. After accepting the explanation, Ozania left. The matter of education, even without a new architectural system interface, was still something Gu Heng would have pursued. It was merely brought forward in time, with the added benefit of divine support. The boosts provided by the architectural system weren't massive, but their critical aspect was their longevity. Whether it was for the academies or for factory enhancements, as long as the core areas under control could maintain stable production, these benefits could last for a long time. Compared to short-term expenses, the long-term output was definitely valuable. Of course, if warfare constantly threatened the areas, even the factories and schools with architectural system benefits would be destroyed, and there would be nothing to say about it. After Ozania left, Denison Henry entered shortly afterward. He had come over from Rubbish Town just this morning. It wasn't specifically to serve as an advisor to Gu Heng, he actually had business to attend to. Do you need more military supplies? Gu Heng asked. Yes, Henry replied, his expression showing a touch of embarrassment. It seemed like only last week he'd said that the previous request for military supplies was the last one, but here he was again needing more. But he had no choice. Currently, he not only served as a consultant for the new Alliance Ministry of Commerce, aligning with the governor, but over the past 2 months in Rubbish Town his status had risen significantly. The once coveted role of an agent, which he could only dream of before, was now within his grasp, and he had indeed secured it. Besides assisting the governor, he now had to consider the interests of Rubbish Town as well. Fortunately, in his view, these two roles did not conflict. Choosing his words carefully, he continued, the main threat is still those green Skin Orcs. Their numbers seem to have grown even more compared to 2 years ago. Our scavengers in Rubbish Town have abandoned several scavenging sites with decent yields. Adventurers have gathered and fought against those green Skin Orcs several times, but to be honest, the physical strength of those green beasts is too high. Even though their weapons are rather primitive, their individual combat capabilities far surpass that of the armed adventurers. As he said this, he paused and looked up to gauge the governor's reaction before continuing, affected by those green Skin Orcs, all of Rubbish Town's waste recycling industries have reduced their output by about 20%. If the situation worsens, this figure is likely to increase. The last batch of military supplies sold to Rubbish Town definitely proved useful. We armed over 3,000 scavengers and managed to withstand the invasion of those greenskins. However, the losses were significant, and not only are we incapable of retaking the original scavenging sites, we are also unsure how much longer we can hold them off. Chapter 157. After hearing Dennison Henry's report, Gu Hang mused, so what do you need? More arms, more powerful heavy equipment. The armed adventurers of Rubbish Town can't keep using ordinary rifles to risk their lives fighting those green Skin Orcs in the high tower ruins, Henry said firmly. The old Alliance's equipment isn't enough. We need G9 series rifles from your regular army, as well as cannons, and if there are armored vehicles, those would be excellent. Rubbish Town can trade anything for them. Our future output can be supplied entirely to Revival City, with Revival City acting as the broker. We can also offer more discounts on the price, whether it's metal raw materials or thermal ash stones. A splendid smile appeared on Gu Hang's face. How about this, then? I give you 20 or so combat vehicles, a dozen tanks, over 100 heavy guns, and 8,000 fully equipped sets of individual gear. What do you think? Henry was stunned. He had been trying to bargain with Mr. Gu. He knew that whether it was combat vehicles or cannons, the new Alliance Legion itself was still in the middle of reorganizing its forces, and every unit was short of supplies. Officers kept urging the logistics department to hurry up and provide the corresponding equipment. He had never really expected to get those two items. He was just trying to bargain in a sky-high manner in the hopes of getting the more reliable G9 series rifles instead of the locally produced firearms. With those weapons, they could manage to have a certain advantage when fighting the green Skin Orcs with 3 to 5 times their numbers, rather than the current situation where they needed 10 times the number just for a stable defense, and nearly 20 times the advantage to dare to attack. Dennison Henry had seen the capability of the G9 series rifles, well-maintained, durable, adaptable to various environments, and more powerful than domestic arms with the added benefits of being lighter and more precise. Truth be told, in times of absolute necessity, even affixing a bayonet would make for a good long-handled melee weapon, more reliable than carrying an extra-large knife. His thoughts had been on securing 1,000 or 2,000 sets of equipment, even willing to lower the price of various raw materials to sell, but Mr. Gu had started with 8,000 sets, plus heavy artillery and combat vehicles? Was this a surprise? More like a shock. Suddenly, Henry wondered, was this Mr. Gu's way of being sarcastic? But instantly, the thought took a more alarming turn. The amount of equipment Mr. Gu mentioned sounded an awful lot like an entire infantry division. Of course, he wouldn't know the specific details of the military reorganization, but he had heard some rumors. Thinking of this, when he lifted his head again, his face was full of shock. And Mr. Gu's smile seemed filled with a chilling air to him. Suppressing the unease in his heart, he asked, Mr. Gu, we don't really need that much armament. Rubbish Town might not be able to gather enough raw materials and supplies to purchase that all at once. But Gu Hang wasn't planning to play any more guessing games, and his following words were quite straightforward. I know Rubbish Town can't afford this, but I could reluctantly accept it if you use the entire Rubbish Town as compensation. As his guess was confirmed, Henry suppressed the unease in his heart and forced a cheerful smile. Do you want to take over all of Rubbish Town? Of course, what's wrong with that? Gu Hang said. Rubbish Town is after all a member of the Alliance and an important raw material supply base. Now, it's under serious threat from the green Skin Orcs, and of course, I will not stand by and do nothing. By the way, I've always found Rubbish Town's production methods and power structure to be less than ideal. It's about time to bring them in line with Revival City. Henry's mind was in complete turmoil. I've toiled so hard for so many years, and it wasn't easy to finally sit in the position of a proxy in Rubbish Town. Now, just half a month into my role, the town is about to be completely gone? But could he resist? Clearly impossible. His position as a proxy was raised by Mr. Gu. Even more so, Mr. Gu's appointment of him as the proxy was clearly a preparation for the day when he would take over Rubbish Town. He himself was well aware of this. He just hadn't anticipated that the day would come so swiftly that he hadn't even managed to settle in properly. Go back and think it over. I hope my army will only need to deal with those green Skin Orcs when the time comes. Gu Heng gave him his last words. Dennis and Henry didn't stay in Revival City for long. He took the vehicle back to Rubbish Town that very day. 200 kilometers, given the infrastructure between Revival City and Rubbish Town, it would take 7 to 8 hours. That's if the road is clear. But this was already a clear commercial route. On the way back, Henry thought very carefully about the whole thing. He quickly understood. What was there to not understand? He was just a newly appointed agent in Rubbish Town, relying on the goods supported by Mr. Gu, not even the biggest among the agents. On the contrary, by leveraging his relationship with Mr. Gu and gaining an entrance into the new Alliance Legion system, wouldn't his position be much more significant than being a leader in Rubbish Town? Besides, would the future alliance still be as rotten as it was over the past 10 years? Judging by Mr. Gu's demeanor, keeping the so-called alliance shell was in fact centralizing power. One could foresee that the new alliance would rapidly expand outward. Mr. Gu had people, guns, money, and righteous cause at his disposal, with starship support from above. In the future, the authority of the new alliance would grow stronger, directly governing more territory. Why wait and not ally with it at once? Whether under the new alliance system as a high-ranking official, or continuing in his current trade as a businessman, clearly, both options held much more promise than muddling along in Rubbish Town. And besides, was this something he could stop? No sooner had the vehicle left Revival City than he began to regret the way he'd presented himself before Mr. Gu. Why did he take such a stance on Rubbish Town's side when he spoke? What was a Rubbish Town agent but rubbish? He was clearly an advisor to the Commerce Department. In his dismay, he quickly thought of a way to remedy the situation. He exchanged a few words with the driver, and the vehicle swiftly turned towards the abandoned mining area of Wuxing City. There, Henry met with Patel, and through their old relationship, he got in touch with Prabhup, found out where his camp was, and then hurried over. In Sanchi Town, Henry saw Prabhup, who had completed his mission of eliminating bandits. He hadn't known before that Sanchi Town was a den of thieves. At best, he knew it was related to plunderers, an important place for disposing of stolen goods and hiding, but he truly didn't know that the whole town was a bandit's nest. He started off with a flurry of praise, saying that wiping out this place was a great thing. At least 5,000 to 6,000 bandits perished in one battle, making the 200 kilometers between Revival City and Rubbish Town much clearer. When had Prabhup ever been so flattered and praised? He was a bit embarrassed by all the adulation. Seeing that the atmosphere was right, Dennis and Henry smoothly extended an invitation. It was for Prabhup to move 50 kilometers to the northeast. That's where Rubbish Town was. You want me to attack Rubbish Town? Prabhup's head shook like a rattle. That's impossible, without military orders, I won't make such a big move. Major Prabhup, you misunderstand. I don't want you to lead a charge on Rubbish Town, just to station your troops not far from there. Of course, I understand such an important action definitely needs Mr. Gu's consent. My purpose in coming to you was also to use your military line to contact Mr. Gu. Prabhup thought for a moment, you want to use my soldiers to bolster your own authority. Henry clapped his hands, smiling, exactly. Mr. Gu intends to mobilize the army and take down Rubbish Town. I thought, if it comes to that, wouldn't it mean we've been inefficient? Chapter 158. Is something not going well? Prabhup appeared somewhat perplexed. At this moment, Henry was also patient enough to explain. He first pointed to himself and said, I am the wedge appointed by the governor to Rubbish Town. If the governor wants Rubbish Town, I am obliged to do so. It would be best if I can settle things before the governor's army arrives. Then, the army would only need to come over and help enforce the new alliance government's system in Rubbish Town. If it comes to the point where the army has to fight, wouldn't that be a sign of my incompetence? After some thought, Prabhupada nodded slightly, seemingly in agreement with Henry's idea. Then Henry moved his hand to point at Prabhupada. As for Major Sir, you have received the governor's orders to come to this wilderness to sweep through all the settlements, relocate the populace, and even those settlements that remain must change their allegiance and accept the complete and thorough rule of the new alliance government. You must flatten all opposition. You have done an acceptable job, but not the best. Within these 200 kilometers, there is Rubbish Town, a peculiar existence. It gathers 100,000 permanent residents, another 100,000 dependent on Rubbish Town's operations for their livelihoods, and yet another 100,000 armed scavengers and adventurers who enter the high tower ruins on a long-term basis. Whether in terms of population or the importance of raw material extraction, this is the most critical place among all the settlements around Revival City. And it's in an awkward position at the edge of your mission range. The governor indeed did not expect you to take down Rubbish Town with just 800 soldiers, but if you could do it, wouldn't that turn what was merely a passable test score into a perfect one? After serious contemplation, Prabhupada had to admit that he was indeed persuaded by Denison Henry. There was a key point Henry didn't know. Didn't he himself clearly understand that he came here to accumulate merits and smoothly take over from Yan Fangxiu, who would eventually become the commander-in-chief of the whole army, and become the brigade commander of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade? Right now, he indeed went by the book and completed his assignment acceptably. Nearly 10 settlements within 200 kilometers had surrendered to the new alliance's rule, and the Battle of the Three Pools was won with a minimal cost, almost completely annihilating the bandits that occupied the area. No one could say he hadn't done well enough. But Prabhupada himself always felt it wasn't enough. Now, with Henry putting Rubbish Town before him, he couldn't help but salivate. Rubbish Town. He still remembered when he was just a miner in the Podong society, living a life truly devoid of daylight. Rubbish Town was a place of might far away. The entire abandoned cave society's next meal depended on whether the traveling merchants of Rubbish Town were willing to pay extra for the ore produced by their society. For him, the presence of Rubbish Town, even more so than the closer Revival City, weighed heavier. And now, could it be that he, this former mining team leader, had the chance to lead his troops and seize such a place? But beyond his thirst for recognition, Prabhupada still managed to stay rational. Even if Rubbish Town could be considered within the governor's 200 kilometers of autonomous activity, he still remembered not to act rashly. It's no small settlement. As Henry had said, within the sphere of Rubbish Town's influence, there were likely 200,000 to 300,000 people, and due to its unique industrial ecosystem, nearly everyone was armed. The armed scavengers and adventurers who licked blood off their blades amounted to a total of around 100,000. They were indeed not an army, but their equipment might be even better than those of robbers, and their combat experience and will were also stronger. If things went wrong and led to a military conflict, he wouldn't be able to win such a battle with just his 800 men. Not to mention, there was a chance he could get mired in the swamp between Rubbish Town and the green Skin Orcs. Thus, he stuck to his previous stance: I need further authorization to take action. Henry smiled slightly. Of course, we'll speak together once we connect the signal later. His objective had been achieved. Even if Prabhupada dared to come along now, he wouldn't dare let him just follow along. He didn't have the audacity to encourage the army to do something beyond their authority without a military order. Too taboo, for even if he succeeded, it might lead to the governor finding a reason to have him killed afterward. He wouldn't make such a mistake. Coming to see Prabhupada, he indeed wanted to borrow the military's communication radio. Of course, beyond that, his greater hope was to persuade Prabhupada himself. Executing orders versus Prabhupad's own proactive engagement were two entirely different scenarios. If Major Prabhupada could also speak up during his subsequent report to the governor, increasing the chance of success, that would be even better. But he hadn't expected his ultimate plan to fall through completely. Because once the radio connected with Revival City, he received news. The governor was no longer in Revival City but had set out with Colonel Tadeus and the 2nd Infantry Division towards Rubbish Town. The governor had left a message. I hope my army will only have to deal with those green Skin Orcs when they arrive. This was something he had heard once before when he met with the governor, but hearing it this time felt different. He turned to Prabhupada. Do you understand what the governor means? Chapter 159. Understood, Prabhupada said, I will lend you a hand. But similarly, I hope it doesn't come to the point of drawing knives and guns. My forces will stop 20 kilometers outside of Rubbish Town. The rest is up to you. If things don't go smoothly, I will wait for the 2nd Infantry Division to arrive before proceeding. That will be enough. Henry appeared to be in control during his conversation with Prabhuv, but in reality, he was extremely anxious. Because he had calculated his own timing. Mostly on foot, the distance from Revival City to Rubbish Town was a little over 200 kilometers. At a normal marching speed, quickly it would take 3 to 5 days, at a slower pace, it would at most not exceed 10 days. Combining this with the phrase left by the governor, this was the time he was given to handle Rubbish Town. He had to hurry. Fortunately, with Prabhuv's composite camp in action, the speed was somewhat guaranteed. This composite camp was almost completely motorized. Even the clumsiest 155mm howitzers had wheels fitted and were towed by trucks. All the soldiers, including the engineer company and logistics support company, had transport trucks and supply trucks at their disposal. In the troop, the slowest and most dragging unit turned out to be the armored company. The 12 old tanks chugged along in the back, only able to move at a speed of 20 km per hour, chugging along, making one fear they would break down along the way. In fact, this situation did occur. Midway through, a tank indeed broke down. But this did not affect the overall pace of the troops. Leaving some repair personnel and crew behind, the rest continued smoothly over a distance of 50 kilometers, arriving at the outskirts of Rubbish Town. By then, it was late at night. The troops stopped in situ, setting up camp, while Dennis and Henry, accompanied by a small retinue and guards, went forward to meet the scouts who had cautiously come from Rubbish Town to check out the situation. After explaining things to them, he then entered the town with composure. Those who came out to reconnoiter did not disperse, still surrounding Prabhuv's forces in the darkness. Prabhuv was not concerned. He had dispatched sentries and guards. As long as these people did not get too close, they were welcome to watch from the periphery. This calm demeanor further intimidated the outsiders peering in from the edges. Of course, what was most intimidating were those large cannons, armored vehicles and tanks that could not be seen clearly in the darkness, but were decidedly present. Add to that the soldiers' discipline and well-trained appearance, the onlookers clearly understood that although this troop was not large in number, its combat power was formidable. Considering the background of the newly appointed agent, Mr. Henry, who could not guess that this was a force from the new alliance, under the command of the esteemed governor. The next day, Dennis and Henry met the person he wanted to see. His name was Jason Swan. He was a man with strands of white in his hair, his face stern, his brows and eyes fierce, weathered, and seasoned. He was the biggest agent in Rubbish Town. In his youth, Jason Swan had already been mixing it up in Rubbish Town. Initially, he was just an ordinary scavenger who was willing to fight and struggled to lead a small adventure group. Later he became the boss, and then he built that small adventure team into an organization, seized a portion of the refined materials business, and later opened up some trading routes. He became an agent, then gradually the biggest one. It might only take a few sentences to say, but from the age of 15 to now, 35 years later, he experienced countless acts of treachery, life and death struggles, to reach his current position. He controlled Rubbish Town's largest initial processing plant for raw materials, had a 20% share in commerce, and the adventures group he built his fortune with, called Clockwork Iron Blade, was one of the top armed forces in Rubbish Town. Industry combined with military power composed the prestige of Mr. Swan. He was always serious and stern, presenting a dignified front to people, and even in the recent troubled times, he had maintained this attitude, which to some extent had a stabilizing effect on the people's hearts. Actually, whether he was truly panicked or not, no one knew. Dennis and Henry had met Jason Swan before, not just once. In every past encounter, he had been as meek as an ant. Even after his nomination to serve as the proxy, the state of their relationship had not changed. Stripping away the new industry of alloy plastic steel he controlled, Henry's actual power paled in comparison to that of the real big shot in Rubbish Town. But today, he had to change his way of thinking, to stand up straight. He represented the governor. His mindset had already begun to shift. Behind me stands the ruler of the entire planet. Once the governor took control of Revival City, that ruler was no longer just a title but was backed by tangible and formidable power. With such a strong backing, why should I grovel to a mere armed merchant leader in Rubbish Town? I was simply too used to kneeling before. Swan seemed to sense something and lifted his head. His gaze, sharp as an eagle's or a wolf's, swept across Henry's face. He began to speak in a somewhat hoarse voice. "Are you here to persuade me to surrender to that governor in Revival City?" Henry's calves still felt a bit weak, and his mind involuntarily flashed with many rumors of Swan's ruthlessness and decisiveness. He wasn't someone with a sturdy backbone at all. But he still tried his best to maintain his dignity. "Yes," he said, "do you have any other choice?" "I could kill you," Swan said indifferently. Henry's heart clenched at those words, but then he relaxed a little. At first hearing, it sounded scary, because Jason Swan did indeed have the capacity to do it. Yet, upon closer analysis, it became apparent that Mr. Swan was merely posturing. Because if, a month ago, Henry had dared to speak of surrender, Mr. Swan would probably not have wasted half a word with him before blowing him away. Now, by saying he could kill him, it was actually a sign of Swan's own apprehension. Instantly grasping this, Henry felt somewhat more relaxed. "Of course, you could do that. You might consider yourself the master of Rubbish Town. What difficulty could there be in killing someone like me?" Henry complimented along Swan's line, but then his tone shifted, beginning a new line of persuasion, "But that's not called a choice." Swan said no more, just stared at Henry. But Henry was getting more heated as he spoke. "Isn't Rubbish Town in its most vulnerable state right now, both externally and internally? The proliferation of the green skin orcs causing a decline in production is the least of the impacts. When those scavengers, those adventurers realize that the danger of entering the high tower ruins has greatly increased while the rewards have diminished, will they still gather here? Especially when Revival City has now intensified its attractiveness to the displaced, with very tempting policies. Without these scavengers and adventurers, what will happen to the industries that rely on them? The taverns, brothels, and haberdasheries will all close, the primary processing industries for the rubbish will collapse, the once thriving trade will no longer be sustainable, and ultimately Rubbish Town will become a real dump, unattended and forgotten. To destroy Rubbish Town, we don't need the green skin orcs to break through our defenses and slaughter our people. They just need to maintain this pressure, make scavenging a high-risk, low-reward venture, and that alone will be enough to destroy our town built on picking through trash." Henry outlined the crisis from an economic foundation. Swan just listened in silence. It wasn't anything insightful. This danger, some had already foreseen, was even already beginning to unfold. Most of Rubbish Town's adventurers and scavengers didn't have much personal attachment to the proxies. A minority was on a hiring basis, and a considerable number were independent adventure groups. They went into the ruins of the city, scavenged, and sold for basic profits. If they found usable technology from before the war, artwork, or relatively intact spiritual energy crystals, they could make a fortune. Now, the risk of adventuring had increased due to the confrontation with the green skin orcs, and the returns were visibly diminishing. They were also specially conscripted to fill the most contentious battlefronts. Although offered bounties and equipment, the fight was still too tough, and many adventure groups refused conscription, even leaving Rubbish Town in entire bands. The departure wasn't yet widespread or on a large scale, but it was an extremely dangerous sign, a precursor to the dam's collapse. Chapter 160. Rubbish Town is now facing a calamity of epic proportions, a fact that many are well aware of. Mr. Swan was waiting to hear Henry's brilliant insights. He could certainly guess that when Henry spoke of these things, he was laying the groundwork to secure complete allegiance to Mr. Gu from Rubbish Town. He was waiting for Henry to state Mr. Gu's terms. Henry knew as well, but he merely smiled, uttering a sentence that nearly made Mr. Swan lose his composure. "Mr. Gu is coming to Rubbish Town, he's on his way with his army." Mr. Swan was silent for a moment, then asked, "Is he coming in person?" "Yes." Henry had now become very composed. "Mr. Gu is set on taking Rubbish Town, we are incapable of resisting. Even without military action, if Mr. Gu were to block trade routes, stop buying raw materials produced by Rubbish Town, and stop selling food to Rubbish Town, it would fall apart without a fight." Huff. Mr. Swan let out a long sigh, his face growing increasingly ugly. "Does Mr. Gu really have to do this?" Henry spread his hands. "What's so surprising about that? He is the governor of this planet, it's only normal for him to strive to bring the entire world under his rule." He paused, then continued, "And to be honest, Mr. Swan, I don't understand why you're so reluctant." "Humph." Mr. Swan said, "Given a choice, who would want to be a dog?" "Ha ha ha ha." Henry laughed loudly. "That's not a fair comparison, offering loyalty to the governor, to the empire, how could that be likened to being a dog?" After laughing, he composed himself and said earnestly, "Mr. Swan, honestly, I once entertained such foolish thoughts as well. When Mr. Gu told me he intended to take full control of Rubbish Town, my initial reaction was frustration that I had barely savored half a month of an agent's power, having reached the upper echelons of Rubbish Town, and now it was going to belong to Mr. Gu, rendering my position meaningless. But that stupid thought lasted only 10 seconds before I realized how ridiculous it was. Who is Mr. Gu? He's the man who, realizing that Revival City was a lost cause, started from scratch and retook Revival City within a matter of 2 months, securing the entire city under his grip. He's the man who thwarted the cult's conspiracy and saved the city. If you go to Revival City now, you'll see that the disaster hasn't destroyed people's spirits, rather, it was like doing demolition work. The whole city is rapidly rebuilding, recovering, and visibly becoming more orderly. If you could see the abandoned district in Wuxing City, where nearly 100,000 heavy industry workers are gathered, they produce a vast quantity of high-quality alloy every day, tanks, heavy artillery, individual soldier equipment, mass-produced from the factories. If you could see all this, you'd have no doubts that Mr. Gu could eventually extend his rule over the entire world, given enough time. Once he integrates a sufficient population, meeting the Empire's tax demands in 2 years' time won't be too much of a challenge. I now feel incredibly honored that I followed Mr. Gu very early on. In the future, as Mr. Gu expands his influence across the entire planet, might I not also have the chance to display my abilities on a planetary scale, or even become an interstellar merchant navigating the cosmos? To speak frankly, this is something I never dared dream of in my past life. My highest aspiration at first was to become an agent. It seems now that my vision was too narrow. What about you, Mr. Swan? You're different from me, you've been at the very center of the stage in Rubbish Town for many years, investing untold effort just to secure a bit more profit, to stand a little more stable on the stage of Rubbish Town. Now, an opportunity lies before you, are you truly not tempted in the slightest? After hearing Henry's words, Mr. Swan scoffed, you're trying to persuade me with such laughable reasons. He dismissed it contemptuously, too displeased to even voice a rebuttal. As beautiful as it sounds, if passing the threshold of imperial taxes were so easy, 5 governors wouldn't have perished. Having control of just a Revival City, a shell formerly known as the Alliance, which virtually no one obeys anymore, and having the audacity to claim certainty over future global dominance is overly arrogant. Indeed, as Henry said, the position as the ruler of Rubbish Town was as high as he could ever hope to rise in this lifetime, there was no further room for advancement. But what of it? In this wasteland strewn with starvation, isn't it enough to be someone of status? Mr. Swan felt that he was content enough. However, his expressed attitude did not dissuade Henry, who responded, "It's a shame you have no interest in the stars and seas. But even now, you have no choice. Mr. Gu has the power to destroy Rubbish Town. I already mentioned that. He doesn't want you to continue being the master of Rubbish Town, and that's just a matter of his will. He could obliterate you with a flip of his hand, but conversely, he's also the only one capable of saving you. Once Rubbish Town submits entirely to Mr. Gu, the approaching troops will not be our enemies but our protectors instead. His forces will direct their firepower against those orc raiders, not at Rubbish Town itself. The issues that concern and trouble you the most will be resolved with ease." Chapter 161. Henry still didn't fully agree with Swan's words. Just rely on those 800 people outside? Just rely on the 7 or 8,000 people that Mr. Gu is bringing along on the road. Battles we can't withstand with 100,000 armed adventurers, and they would be able to resolve them. Henry just smiled again, did not speak, and simply stretched out his hand and pointed to the sky. Swan understood immediately, and then he really went silent. He was still unwilling to accept it, but he had to admit that every word Henry said was right. To live, they had to rely on Mr. Gu, no one else could save Rubbish Town. To die, Mr. Gu had far too many ways to kill them, even without lifting a finger himself. In such a situation, what right did he have to negotiate any terms? But not to negotiate any terms at all? To hand over everything he had fought for over the past 35 years? Henry seemed to see his worries and a voice tempting like a devil whispered in his ear. "Even if we don't mention those ideals in the future, I will just say one thing, Mr. Gu, all of a sudden, gained control over such a vast region from a starting point of almost nothing, and with Rubbish Town under his control, the total population would exceed 1,300,000. Conversely, Mr. Gu's rapidly expanding power is in short supply of talents. A female refugee from the Green Valley region can become the civil affairs chief of Revival City. A small merchant like me who was once insignificant in Rubbish Town can now represent Mr. Gu in discussions about the life and death of Rubbish Town with someone like you. So, if someone like you, experienced and capable, is willing to help Mr. Gu wholeheartedly, what kind of status would you obtain? Henry felt that Swan must have been persuaded by him. Although he did not give a definitive answer in the end, and even when he expressed a desire to contact Mr. Gu directly, he was brushed off on the pretext that he needed to report to Mr. Gu, but Henry still felt that in the end, Swan would definitely kneel before Mr. Gu unconditionally when he arrived at Rubbish Town. Because he had no choice. Besides, he could not really make any specific promises on behalf of Mr. Gu. He did not even think that Mr. Gu would agree to anything. At most, he would allow Swan to earn what he wants through his own performance. It also reminded him of the time he wanted the exclusive rights to alloy steel for Mr. Gu but ended up being scared stiff. That's when he realized what kind of person Mr. Gu was. Mr. Gu, even when he had nothing, already had the mentality of someone in a superior position, let alone now. Furthermore, he believed that even if Mr. Gu agreed to nothing, Mr. Swan would still end up humbly prostrating himself before Mr. Gu. Henry comforted himself by staying in the room Mr. Swan had prepared for him, waiting for Swan to give him a definite answer before the deadline or for Mr. Gu's arrival. On the third day, a servant came to ask him to see Mr. Swan. Despite his expectations, Henry still could hardly conceal his delight. He was absolutely confident that Swan must have submitted. Following the servant, he saw Mr. Swan in the office. "You've realized?" Henry hadn't finished speaking when Swan interrupted him. "I agree, and I will make all the other agents agree as well. If there are any who don't, I will make sure they have no other choice but to agree as soon as possible." Henry was stunned. That was a 180-degree change in attitude. "But why are you more anxious than me?" He keenly felt like something big had happened. "When can Mr. Gu's army arrive?" "At the earliest, in 2 days, and at the latest, 5. Can we go any faster?" "Wait a second, what's happened? You need to tell me first." Henry's heart was already uneasy. Those green skin orcs. "Yes," he sighed. "There wasn't much point in hiding it. Poor communication of military intelligence could easily lead to strategic misjudgments." Afterward, Swan gave Henry a rough outline of the current situation. In the past, Rubbish Town didn't have much by way of management. It was originally just a town formed by adventurers picking up trash, but as the number of adventurers increased, many industries reliant on the rubbish collected by them started cropping up, gradually forming the town. But as the town took shape and the industrial chain became more complete, a somewhat finer level of management became essential. The agents roughly divided Rubbish Town toward the pre-war era's supercity ruins, also known as the High Tower Ruins, into 4 levels: valueless safe areas, valuable safe areas, high-value dangerous areas, and unknown areas. Valueless safe areas, true to their name, are places where, after years of exploration, the number of mutant monsters has greatly diminished, but similarly, due to many years of scavenging, they have almost no yield. The only output here is the hot ash produced after a low-energy storm has passed. Valuable safe areas are places that have been cleared many times, have few monsters and are not very dangerous, but have only become relatively safe in the past 1 or 2 years. They haven't been scavenged for long and still yield a fair amount. This is where the most metal waste is produced, and occasionally, some precious pre-war items can be found. High-value dangerous areas are places teeming with monsters, but with ample rewards. Unknown areas are almost unexplored, or where very few who enter manage to come out alive. These 4 types of areas, in terms of distance relative to Rubbish Town, grow progressively further away. And in the fight against the orcs, the defense zones were divided in the same way. Or rather, in recent years as the greenskin orcs began activity within the High Tower Ruins, even becoming more and more numerous, eventually turning into adventurers' main foes, the classification of the 4 areas was largely related to the orcs' activity frequency. 1 month ago, when the greenskin orcs began to emerge in large numbers, the high-risk areas basically became no-go zones, only accessible to large adventure groups with many members. After a month of this greenskin disaster, a considerable part of the low-risk area turned high-risk. Adventurers could no longer easily scavenge but had to form teams and battle lines to fight these greenskin orcs. This had nearly evolved into a warfare situation, rather than skirmishes between small groups of adventurers and lurking or wandering monsters. For that very reason, adventurers were reaching the point where they could hardly hold on, not willing to endure any further. "We're here to make money through adventure, not to fight a war." Now, the latest news was that in the 18th district, an important place where adventurers formed a battle line and had built fortifications for a large-scale battle with the invading green Skin Orcs, had fallen apart. Nearly 20,000 adventurers had gathered there, fighting against more than 3,000 orcs for a week, under immense pressure. And just this morning, 3 adventure groups, without notifying anyone, withdrew from their positions. A total of 6,000 people left directly. Consequently, during an expected orc assault on the defences, with nearly a third fewer hands, the defensive line completely collapsed, and the remaining adventurers had no choice but to retreat or even scatter. By morning, the Greenskins had broken through 3 districts, and it was only in the 5th district that they were barely held back. And this area was traditionally a valueless safe zone. Even, Swan had already deployed his most treasured adventure group, Clockwork Blades, to the front lines. They were well equipped and highly trained, a rare elite force. It was their intervention that plugged the breach. However, the casualties were significant. What was crucial was that, through the breach, more greenskin monsters kept emerging from the deeper ruins, exerting tremendous pressure on them. If the 5th district fell, the other parallel districts' defences would surely not hold either, and before long, Rubbish Town might genuinely face the greenskins at its gates. That's why Swan was in such a hurry. Chapter 162. Henry couldn't hold back and blurted out a curse. Swan had indeed submitted, and from that perspective, the deserters' rout and the Greenskin Orcs' sudden onslaught had helped a bit. However, Henry surely couldn't hand over a rubbish town turned to ruins to Mr. Goo and then shamelessly claim he had fulfilled his mission, could he? With a grim expression, Henry asked, "What's the situation in the 5th district now?" "It's terrible, there's been no time to build new defensive positions there, our people can only fight desperately with those greenskins among the rubble. No one knows whether the adventurers can hold on, I can only guarantee that my men will hold firm until the end. I will pass this message to Mr. Goo as soon as possible. Mr. Swan, if you don't want to present a rubbish town turned to ruins to Mr. Goo and thoroughly disappoint him, please do whatever you can in the next few days to hold the line, at least until Mr. Goo's troops arrive." Swan said solemnly, "You don't need to tell me that, but please urge them on. Nobody in Rubbish Town wants it to become ruins, but sometimes it's not about what we want." After saying this, he paused and hesitantly made another request, "Additionally, the troops stationed outside Rubbish Town, can they help?" Henry hesitated. He paced back and forth, conflicted. Without Swan asking, he had already thought about the strong army outside Rubbish Town that could be called for reinforcement. But there was a risk involved. Convincing Prabhup to seek authorization for action from Mr. Goo seemed manageable. Prabhup was eager to fight, and Mr. Goo, knowing of Swan's submission and Rubbish Town's surrender, would likely allow Prabhup to join the battle. But that would mean sending the composite camp to fight the fearsome greenskin hordes. Were they an easy opponent? Prabhup's composite camp was formidable, slaughtering looters as easily as slaughtering pigs, but the greenskins were a different matter entirely. If casualties were heavy, would that responsibility fall on him? Yet in the end, he gritted his teeth and told Swan he was willing to try. With Rubbish Town willing to fully submit to Mr. Goo, it was worth protecting. Securing Rubbish Town was of great significance to Mr. Goo's expansion of power. It was the most important raw material production area around Revival City, as well as the strongest military force among the uncontrolled powers in the vicinity. It was also his biggest stepping stone to advancement. As Henry had expected, convincing Prabhup to go into battle was not difficult. Once Mr. Goo was informed of the entire situation here, especially the likelihood that Rubbish Town's defences might indeed be breached by the Greenskin Orcs and destroyed, he of course did not want to see that happen. He granted Prabhup the necessary authority, allowing him to make decisions based on the situation. Meanwhile, the troops led by Mr. Goo himself also accelerated their march. With authorization in hand, Prabhup did not hesitate for long and quickly launched a full assault. The fully mechanized troops rapidly bypassed Rubbish Town, heading towards the so-called 5th district. Along the way, all Prabhup saw was chaos. Many adventurer groups, hastily assembled for a hefty fee, formed up and rushed towards the 5th district, but at the same time, Prabhup saw even more adventurers retreating from the front lines. Among those moving back, a considerable part looked very shabby and frightened. These clearly were deserters who had fled from the front lines. Additionally, some of the retreating adventurers bore no signs of battle. This group was somewhat odd. Prabhupada had several different groups of adventurers stopped and brought to him to inquire about the situation at the front lines. From the accounts of the deserters, he received news that was uncertain whether to be considered good or bad. The battle at the front was still ongoing, but without fortifications, the orcs easily got close enough for combat, causing massive casualties. One group of adventurers after another couldn't withstand such terrifying losses and retreated from the front lines. To say it's good news was because the front lines were still holding, to take it as bad news was because it was on the verge of collapse. The other group retreating without having fought told a more intriguing story. They had received orders to pull back. These orders came from the merchants and agents who had paid to hire them. Prabhupada didn't know much about Rubbish Town, but Henry, who had come to the front lines with him in the command vehicle, immediately understood what it meant. The pessimists thought Rubbish Town was indefensible. They had withdrawn the teams they had paid for, no longer maintaining the battle line at the front, instead wanting them to protect themselves and flee from Rubbish Town. Even likely, the news that Mr. Gu was taking over Rubbish Town might have leaked, which also fueled the desire of these merchants and agents to flee. After all, if Rubbish Town was defended successfully, it wouldn't be theirs anyway, so why spend money defending it? Better to run away quickly. Thinking of this, Henry was particularly angry. How could Rubbish Town be saved amongst these vermin? This could certainly lead to a complete collapse of the front line. Prabhu's composite camp continued to advance, while Henry used the communication equipment on his command vehicle to contact Swan, who was still in Rubbish Town, informing him of the situation here. Chapter 163. Swan said he would find a way to deal with it. He wasn't just going to handle those who wanted to flee, he would also try to rally the fleeing soldiers and maintain the battle line as much as possible. Hearing Swan's assurance, Henry breathed a sigh of relief. This big shot from Rubbish Town, if he truly intended to stop this situation from worsening, probably had a way to do so. But there was one thing that Henry felt uncertain about: what if Swan himself wanted to run? What if he had convinced Prabhupada to go to the front lines just to buy time to move assets and wealth? To put it bluntly, he was afraid Swan was deceiving him. For a moment, he felt a confusing turmoil inside. Seeing that Prabhupada had already begun to give orders for the artillery support unit to deploy, he said to Prabhupada, "I'll stay here." He paused, then continued, "There's no help I could provide at the front, better to stay here. Leave me a radio set, and I'll keep in touch with the interior of Rubbish Town at all times to ensure no unrest occurs. If all goes well, I'll manage to rally some fleeing soldiers and retreating units here. If there really is a major problem inside Rubbish Town, I'll notify you in time. I won't let your army get mired alone." "All right, let's do that." Half an hour later, at the front lines of the 5th District. As expected, the battle was still ongoing, with many adventurers resisting, but they had no advantage. From a distance, the green Skin Orcs were killing the adventurers one by one, and occasionally, entire teams of adventurers were collapsing and retreating. Among them, those with the most resolute fighting attitude were a group wearing grey combat coats. On their arms, they had uniform armbands with the image of a spear piercing upward through the skull of an orc. This armband represented an adventuring group that had only been established 6 months ago but had rapidly expanded and swollen in size, the Beast Slaughter Group. These were people determined to take revenge on the green Skin Orcs, gathered together to form a team. Its founder, who was also the current leader, was named Lucy Lee Koxi. Lee Kexi used to be the leader of a medium-sized adventuring group, often mixing in Rubbish Town. Known for his generosity, enthusiasm, and loyalty, he held a reputation within the entire adventurer industry. 6 months ago, his group encountered a band of green Skin Orcs and were nearly wiped out. He and a significant part of his comrades were captured by the orcs. He witnessed many of his closest comrades having their heads split open and their brains devoured, their abdomens ripped open to be used as food by the orcs. Among them were even his wife and 2 sons. Later, the small orc encampment was raided by another team of adventurers. During the chaos, Lee Kexi managed to escape. Since then, he dissolved his former group and established a new adventuring team named Beast Slaughter Group, intent on revenge. Anyone harboring a grudge against the green Skin Orcs and determined to eliminate them could join the adventuring group. In fact, it could no longer be considered a usual adventuring group as their main goal was no longer urban exploration and scavenging for high-value items, but instead hunting down green Skin Orcs. In the past few years, there were no shortage of people with grudges against the green Skin Orcs. Some would be terrified by the orcs' strength, brutality, and belligerence, but naturally, there were also those who were instead filled with anger and hatred. They gathered in the beast slaughter group and began their war against the green Skin Orcs. For Rubbish Town, which was facing an increasingly severe threat from the Orcs, such a team was, of course, very welcome. Although they were not productive, no longer scavenging, and rarely accepting employments, the merchants and agents from various districts of Rubbish Town were still willing to provide generously for their weaponry, logistics support, and even additional financial aid. With hatred fueling them internally and financial support externally, the Beast Slaughter Group expanded rapidly over 6 months and also proved to be the best performing team in combating the green Skin Orcs out of all adventuring groups in Rubbish Town. Their original defense zone was neither in the 18th District nor in the 5th District. However, after the outer defense line of the 18th District was breached and pierced through to the 5th District, they too had to retreat to avoid being flanked. At the same time, they realized the Orcs' breakthroughs were not yet over. If they were allowed to continue their assault, Rubbish Town, the major rear area, could very well be lost. Lee Kexi led his Beast Slaughter group, which boasted more personnel than usual, to the 5th District for reinforcements, trying to plug the gaps in the defense line. Then, as the battle raged on, his forces became the mainstay. Other allied forces retreated one after another until only a few remained fighting alongside them. Grasping his personally modified shotgun, which had 3 large barrels bound together, Lee Kexi pulled the trigger, and the barrage of large caliber shot at close range blew apart the head of a green Skin Orc. "Pa!" He spat out the cigarette in his mouth that was almost burnt to the end, looking around him. A sense of sorrow welled up inside his heart. He knew this might be where his bones would finally lie. The number of greenskins rushing towards the gap in the defense line seemed to have surpassed 3,000, by contrast, the only ones still persevering in combat, apart from his own 3,000-strong Beast Slaughter group, were probably just 1,000 or so other adventurers. Chapter 164. Based on past experience, to withstand the onslaught of the green Skin Orcs, especially at such a close range, one would need at least 10 times the number of enemies to gain victory. Holding out with 5 times the number is the bare minimum to maintain a defense. Despite his Beast Slaughter group mastering some special techniques through long-term combat with the Orcs, and even with weapons specifically modified to fight them, they could at best manage to fight 3 against 1. Now, the number of combatants on each side had not even reached a 2-to-1 ratio, a situation which, according to experience, meant the defense would not hold. But beyond the 5th District, there was no other line of defense. His deputy had already asked more than once what to do. And his answer had always been the same. We must fight to the death. His own will to fight was unwavering, and he understood that if they let the green Skin Orcs break through Rubbish Town, they would no longer have a chance for revenge. The Orcs would gain greater living space, and humanity would face utter defeat in this region. He was prepared to die. But the Beast Slaughter group was faltering. Although the performance of the Beast Slaughter group was better than that of any other adventuring band, they were still human. Hatred and anger could sustain their ferociousness in battle, but fear remained, and not everyone could face a certain death with equanimity. He could feel that many of his brothers were already wavering. At first, he was anxious, but he soon settled into a calm state. Go ahead, if a few more can live, that's good. In such a desperate situation, I simply wish to die in battle against these Orcs. I can't necessarily ask the same of others. After painstakingly loading his ammunition, he strode forward. Another green Skin Orc charged towards him howling, and 3 of his brothers opened fire. Despite being shot several times, the Orc stood firm, lifted a crudely made firearm, and quickly killed 2 men. The third man charged forward with a long-handled greatsword and slashed at the Orc's head. The flesh burst open and blood flowed, but the skull was not cleaved, the blade stuck in it. The Orc, however, pulled out a hand axe and split the brave Beast Slaughter group warrior's head with a backhand swing. The Orc pulled the great sword out from its head, blood smeared all over its face, and howled to the sky as if mad. Bang! Seizing the opportunity, he approached within 5 or 6 meters of the Orc. The exaggeratedly designed triple-barreled shotgun was pointed at the Orc's head and he fired. The Orc's face distorted by the blast, it fell backward to the ground. Rubbing his shoulder, aching from the recoil, he saw 2 more Orcs approaching. At that moment, there were no brothers by his side, and he clearly didn't have time to reload the triple-barreled shotgun. He dropped the firearm and took out the Beast Slaughter group's signature long-handled greatsword. This must be the last fight before death, he thought. He wondered if he could take down an Orc before he died. He couldn't aim for the head, limbs, or torso, which would not be instantly fatal. The only target was the neck. He needed to exert full strength and get the angle right as the blade penetrated the flesh, only then might he have a chance of severing the spine. He had only one chance with his blade. If he missed, the orc's strength, far superior to a human's, would tear him to shreds in no time. He took deep breaths, waiting for the final moment to come. The two orcs, one in front and one behind, drew ever closer. They seemed to be competing to get to him first, fearing that slow movement would rob them of the chance to kill. Just then, a loud noise came from behind, followed by a rocket trailing flames. The rocket exploded right in front of him, hitting the two monsters, one behind the other, and flipping them over. The one behind was already dead, while the other landed not far from Li Kexi. Ignoring the singed hair from the trailing flames, Li Kexi quickly walked up and chopped off the monster's head with 3 swings of the sword. Only then did he have a moment to turn his head and see a squad of unfamiliar soldiers approaching from behind. It was a small combat team of 3, 2 armed with rifles, 1 with a rocket launcher. The recent rocket came from them. And now, the man with the rocket launcher was pulling new rockets from the large tactical pack on his back to reload, the other 2 kept firing at another approaching orc in the distance. The firearms in their hands were unfamiliar to Li Kexi. He had never seen such rifles, black and clearly well crafted, different from the iron tube rifles many adventurers carried. Looking in the direction of the gunfire, the orc being targeted was clearly hit repeatedly. The two groups were about 100 meters apart. 100 meters, what does that mean? From a distance, the orc seemed hardly bigger than a small black dot. At this range, accurate shooting not only indicated the precision of the unfamiliar soldiers but also meant that their rifles were extremely reliable in terms of accuracy. Using the rifles commonly employed by adventurers, even if aimed precisely, the bullet trajectory at 100 meters was unpredictable. In fact, the firearms used by the green-skin orcs were similar, perhaps even less reliable. The orc firearms were surprisingly powerful. Within the effective range, a single shot could blast apart an entire upper body. But their effective range was only within 50 meters, beyond which the bullets would stray significantly, even worse than the adventurers' iron tube rifles. Chapter 165. For this very reason, the adventurers used to engage in regular combat with the green-skin orcs at distances within 100 meters. Between 50 and 100 meters, the adventurers had some firepower advantage, but the greenskins were able to rely on their thick hides to charge within 50 meters, at which point exchanging fire was no contest at all. One of their shots could blow apart a person, while our side's puny guns needed to pour 100 bullets to kill a single greenskin. How could we fight like that? Moreover, once the greenskins got within 50 meters, aside from shooting, their steps wouldn't stop, and they would charge even closer to take advantage of the high power but low accuracy of their guns. Or more directly, they'd get into melee range and resolve the battle with cold weapons. And often by that time, it was when the human adventurers' morale completely collapsed. Except for the beast slaughter group, who dared to wield big knives and engage in chopping at the greenskins with an exchange rate of more than 5 to 1, nobody dared to engage these monsters in close combat. But these new and strange infantry seemed a bit different. Not only did they have the extremely precious rocket launchers, but their rifles still worked effectively at distances beyond 100 meters. This was significant. The orc charging toward this location got hit by at least 30 bullets when it reached 50 meters away, and despite firing 2 shots, both missed. Following that, it continued its charge, and when it got within 50 meters, it finally couldn't withstand the frequent hits and fell dead. The shooters weren't just from this infantry squad, there were 2 additional infantry squads who had evidently also spotted it and were firing 6 guns at it. Li Kexi couldn't help feeling envious. Envious of the rocket launcher, and of those guns. At the same time, he couldn't help but wonder a bit, where did these strangers come from? He had extensive connections, he knew most of the named adventure groups that mingled around Rubbish Town. He had never seen any group equipped like this. He saw someone waving at him. Li Kexi hesitated for a moment but still went over. He asked, "Which group are you from?" The person waving at him was momentarily confused, then quickly responded, "We're not from any adventure group. We are warriors from the New Alliance. I am Sergeant Luke Duffy." The amount of information was a bit overwhelming, and Li Kexi for a moment didn't even know what to say. Nov. L. B //JNN. Sergeant Duffy noticed the armband on his arm and asked, "Are you also from the Beast Slaughter group?" "Yes." "Then get to the rear as quickly as possible, many of your comrades are regrouping there." We still need your help to put in a joint effort to clean out these filthy green skin monsters. Li Kexi was stunned again. His resolve to die retreated. If there was still hope of victory, then indeed he shouldn't die. If possible, he still hoped to see more green skin monsters die before his eyes. Sergeant Luke Duffy, I'll remember you. I am Li Kexi, captain of the Beast Slaughter Group. May we meet again under better circumstances. You're the captain. Duffy was startled, then quickly added, that's even better. You have to get to the rear then, your brothers still need your leadership. You're right. Li Kexi picked up his rifle and followed the direction Luke Duffy had pointed. After walking a bit further, intense gunfire and the sound of rocket launchers firing came from behind him. He couldn't resist looking back and saw 10 soldiers form into 3 combat squads. They didn't advance further but held their current position. Before them, a group of about 20 greenskins was approaching. Li Kexi's heart sank heavily. Especially seeing that 2 rocket projectiles thrown at them killed only 3 greenskins. 10 soldiers, their distant gunfire raining down, even with focused fire at long range, killed only 2. 15 remained. They had already charged very close. Within this distance, in just a few seconds, these monsters would rush upon the soldiers' faces. And in the meantime, they couldn't even reload their magazines, nor could the rocket launchers be replenished with new ammunition in time. Li Kexi was not optimistic about their fate and hesitated whether to turn back and fight alongside them. Of course, this was not a wise decision, but they had just saved his life, and now was he to turn his back on them, to live in ignominy? While he was in the throes of indecision, he heard 2 rumbling sounds from behind him. Turning his head, he saw 2 steel behemoths emerge from behind a building. One of them was a tank, the Challenger tank he had seen once before. The other was a somewhat lighter armored but more robust-looking wheeled combat vehicle. They both fired at the green Skin Orcs. Chapter 166. Seeing the appearance of a Challenger tank and another war machine he didn't recognize, Li Kexi was initially stunned. He had truly not expected to see such a thing here. He had once thought about buying a Challenger tank, especially after forming the Beast Slaughter Group. His desire grew stronger. If he had such a tank as the Combat Corps, surrounded by a large number of infantry troops with a cannon ready to provide fire support at any time, battles would be much easier to fight. Unfortunately, affording it was one thing, the key issue was that there was no channel to purchase it. Not to mention the armored vehicle next to it. Though it had no large cannon, the twin-barreled machine gun was not something to be underestimated. And when these 2 opened fire together, the effect was astonishing. A tank shell blasted into the midst of the green Skin Orcs, killing at least 3 on impact. Even more terrifying was the volley from the armored vehicle's machine gun and the alongside machine guns that didn't look like regular ones. The 40mm caliber machine gun could cause fatal damage when it hit the green skins. The strange, explosive twin-barreled machine gun could still detonate inside an enemy after a direct hit, ensuring the death of an orc. Under the frenzy of the strafing fire, 6 or 7 greenskins were killed on the spot with 1 round. After this round of fire projection, coupled with the casualties inflicted by the infantry squad, a total of 15 greenskin orcs were killed. Facts proved that orcs were not brainless creatures that only knew how to charge in battle. On the contrary, their wisdom or rather, instinct, in combat was exceptionally sharp. Nov. L. B/JNN. They knew that continuing to charge forward under such firepower would result in their deaths before they could cover the final 20 to 30 meters. They scattered to the sides and quickly found cover. One even poked his head out and took a shot at the infantry squad, actually hitting and breaking a soldier's left arm. Someone quickly administered first aid with gauze, mainly pressing on the wound to stop the bleeding and minimize blood loss, and then 2 others helped to evacuate the injured to the rear. The remaining 7 soldiers were in no hurry to advance. They would wait for the tank and the armored vehicle to come up. Only after clearing this wave of enemies would they continue forward, encountering and stopping at the next enemy, fighting to try to eliminate the enemy, or if not possible, preserving their combat power, with the tank and armored vehicle soon supporting them again. Infantry and tank coordination is not as simple as armored units leading with infantry following behind, using the tank or armored vehicle as cover. That's a very rudimentary approach. Indeed, in relatively open terrain with few obstacles, armored units can lead the assault with infantry closely following within tens of meters to support the attack. But at this moment, in this location, in the midst of urban ruin combat, it is usually necessary for the infantry to lead, with armored units providing fire support from behind and leveraging the infantry's close combat advantage to eliminate the enemy one by one. If armored units led under these circumstances, with complex terrain and enemy situations, who knows what sort of enemy might emerge and what weapons they could use to threaten the armored vehicles. For example, enemy infantry could be lying in ambush, utilizing explosive charges, anti-tank rocket launchers, and other weapons to deliver a severe blow to the tanks and armored vehicles. Of course, these so-called infantry-tank coordination tactics were not something Lee Kexi could understand clearly. He only knew that the seemingly numerous cluster of green Skin Orcs stood no chance of turning the tables, and their fate was certain annihilation. Compared to the tactics of coordinated operation between tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry, what Lee Kexi envied even more were the tanks and armored vehicles themselves. His entire beast slaughter group, with 6,000 or 7,000 men, couldn't muster a single tank, yet an infantry squad's attack tactic included the coordination of tanks and armored vehicles. All were human, so why what a huge gap there was. Tactics could be practiced, but equipment, if you didn't have it, you really didn't have it, and there was nothing you could do about it. Perbuff was not in the best of spirits. He had already received several casualty reports. According to the earlier plan, there were nearly 20 infantry tank coordinated assault groups operating in phases, controlling a battlefield front about 3 to 4 kilometers wide. He had ordered the frontline combat units to advance 2 kilometers forward, planning to strike a blow to the green Skin Orcs that were still rushing in. Perbuff's troops did indeed accomplish the predetermined objectives, and in the 2-kilometer advance, at least 300 green Skin Orcs were eliminated under the fire of the infantry and armored units. But his troops did not come out unscathed during this process. 2 tanks were destroyed, 3 armored vehicles were lost, and over 50 soldiers were casualties. That was distressing enough for him. And indeed, such casualties would impact the entire battalion's combat effectiveness. The biggest single loss was when an assault group nearly got wiped out. Perbuff saw a verbal briefing from the evacuated wounded soldiers, who reported that during their march, they were ambushed by green Skin Orcs. Those greenskins cleverly hid in the building ruins and avoided the infantry's search range. Then they launched a simultaneous assault, and by the time they were discovered, they were already within 60 to 70 meters. Chapter 167. These orc-like creatures tactically divided into 4 formations and launched simultaneous attacks on both the infantry at the front and the armored units at the rear. Suddenly engaging in close quarters, the infantry squads suffered greatly in the exchange of fire. They managed to kill 4 or 5 enemies at close range, but they were also subjected to close-range blasts from the green skins. The crude firearms in their hands could incapacitate a soldier with a single shot. Even if it hit a bulletproof vest it might not be fatal, but breaking ribs and causing internal injuries that significantly reduced combat capability was not an issue. What was even more terrifying was that the greenskins were fond of using shotguns. The scattered pellets sometimes even shattered limbs. In close-quarter combat, the casualties among the soldiers were heavy. After that, when the greenskins closed into the range of melee combat, despite the G9 rifles being equipped with bayonets and serving as decent pole weapons, they were still no match for the greenskins. More critically, they could not get immediate fire support from the armored units. The armored units had their own troubles. Over 20 green Skin Orcs, using obstacles as cover, approached the vehicles from the side and continuously moved while the artillery and machine gun angles were rotating, forcing the vehicles to be unable to fully utilize their firepower advantage. Despite a considerable number of greenskins dying in the charge and 2 being taken down by the protective infantry accompanying the armored units, 7 or 8 still managed to get close. With their shotguns, they eliminated the accompanying infantry and placed explosive packages on the tanks' tracks and the rear sides of the armor, and the armored vehicles received the same treatment. Such explosive packages destroyed a tank and an armored vehicle. Had it not been for the squad leader who was ambushed immediately sending out a distress signal, and fortuitously, a team located just a few hundred meters away coming to their aid, they might have been completely wiped out. Yet, even so, their losses could still be considered severe. Of the more than 20 infantry who survived, only 6 remained, 1 tank was destroyed, and out of 2 infantry fighting vehicles, only 1 was left. A warning bell sounded in Perbuff's head. The enemy they faced this time wasn't something easy to deal with like common marauders. Although these green Skin Orcs only had light and melee weapons at their disposal and had to rely on such primitive methods as manually placing explosives to destroy armored units, it was apparent that the greenskins were severely lacking in long-range firepower. But by virtue of their beast-like physical fitness and their surprisingly strong combat ability at close range, as well as their reckless disregard for death, even if his forces had a significant firepower advantage over the enemy, they still could not avoid losses in battle. From the time they left Wuxing City until now, Prabhu's 1st Battalion had already lost 2 tanks, 1 had broken down en route and had not been repaired, 2 armoured vehicles, and nearly 100 personnel were either killed or wounded. This meant his forces had already lost over 10%. The battle against the Greenskins would surely be tough, but they had already sustained such heavy casualties at the very beginning. What about moving forward? Unthinkable. But soon, he pushed these tentative thoughts back down. The fight had to go on. The troops that set out earlier had, as planned, advanced the front line by 2 kilometers, eliminating a considerable number of Greenskins. Also, because of their decisive push forward, many Greenskins that had been on the offensive had to pull back. It must be stated again that although these Greenskins were wild, warlike, and bloodthirsty, prone to get carried away, they were not without intelligence. On the contrary, they were quite cunning and pragmatic when it came to combat. Realizing that they were at a great disadvantage and suffering heavy losses in open ground combat against armored assaults, those Greenskins didn't continue to stubbornly charge headlong into firepower with their flesh and blood. This made Prabhu somewhat regretful, otherwise, the number of Greenskin heads taken might have been more than just over 300. The retreating Greenskins started to construct simple fortifications, or simply relied on the ruins of the terrain, and set up layered defenses. The difficulty for the armored combined force to continue advancing would become much greater after that. It was foreseeable that further assault would not only see a sharp decline in military achievements, but their own losses would be significant, and it was possible they would face a 1-to-2 or even 1-to-1 casualty rate. Prabhu did not have enough troops to wear down these Greenskins. Having achieved the predetermined objectives, there was no need to continue pushing forward. The front-line combat units began to fortify their positions on site, also relying on the ruins of the terrain, and started constructing key fire points and defensive fortifications. Their advantage over the Greenskins lay in the fact that their defensive positions were supported by armored vehicles and tanks providing mobile firepower from a distance. If the Greenskins dared to rush out and charge the positions, tank cannons, machine guns, and bomb-firing machine guns would teach them a lesson. Both sides thus entered a standoff phase. If this situation were maintained, Prabhu could accept it. He had already discussed and agreed upon the objectives of this operation with the commissar at the battalion headquarters, as well as with several staff members and adjutants. They could not possibly reverse the deteriorating situation of the entire war with the strength of just one battalion. What they needed to do was to stabilize the front lines, be the mainstay, plug the gaps, and stop an all-out collapse. Chapter 168. As long as the battle could be sustained until the governor arrived, it would be considered a success. But those green skin orcs seemed to have no intention of backing down, they still had ideas of breaking through human defenses. But this time, Prabhu wasn't going to be polite with them. 10 miles from the front lines, the 155mm howitzer positions were fully constructed. It wasn't the rush stage anymore, a large number of adventurers had retreated from the front lines and reorganized, there was no need to worry about friendly fire, and the shooting elements from the front lines had already been transmitted back. Without a second thought, they fired 5 rounds of artillery. 60 heavy artillery shells fell on the Greenskin Orcs' attack route within less than 10 minutes, and the nearest shell landed less than 100 meters from the front line soldiers. It was difficult to determine the exact casualties caused by these 5 rounds of artillery beyond the front line defenses, but a rough estimate suggested that the Greenskin Orcs suffered more casualties than previously inflicted by tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry combined. After another loss of 300 to 400 Greenskin Orcs, the attackers at the 5th district had basically lost 20% of their fighting force. After 5 rounds of shelling, the surge of strength the Greenskin Orcs had been gathering for a charge came to an abrupt end, and they finally ceased their aggressive push. A 20% loss, of course, hadn't exceeded the threshold of what the Greenskin Orcs could withstand. But casualties must have meaning. Stubbornly advancing under heavy artillery to attack layered defense positions isn't about bravery, it's about stupidity. Greenskins are never stupid in battle. Moreover, the Greenskins weren't necessarily forced to continue this deadly struggle. The width of the 1st Battalion's combat front stretched at most 5 to 6 kilometers. Yet the overall width of the attack front toward Rubbish Town within the High Tower ruins probably exceeded 60 kilometers, encompassing the entire High Tower district as well as the surrounding suburban areas. There was ample front line width for maneuvers such as flanking and encirclement. If they couldn't bite through, then they would simply stop biting and strike elsewhere. Prabhu understood this as well. The scale of this war was, after all, nearly 100,000 adventurers and armed scavengers facing off against 10 to 20,000 green Skin Orcs. An 800-person composite camp, however well equipped, served as a significant weight, capable of tipping the balance of the scales. But that was the extent of it. One couldn't expect a single camp to hold a 60-kilometer front line. Achieving the current battlefield results was sufficient. They had inflicted significant casualties on the Greenskins' fighting force and stabilized the defense line, holding off the peak of the Greenskin Orcs' assault forces, gaining time to reorganize the follow-up troops. Perbuff had done all he could. What remained to be seen was how people like Denison Henry and Jason Swan would handle the situation. Oh, and one more thing, he had received intelligence that the leader of the Beast Slaughter group had been rescued by them. Perhaps he could be counted on as well. Perbuff had an estimate of how long he could hold out. He could defend until the artillery support ran out of ammunition. If the pressure became too great and the 155mm howitzer shells were exhausted, then there was no room for discussion, it was time to retreat promptly. Not to retreat would mean sacrificing the troops for nothing. A 155mm howitzer shell weighed 60 kilograms, and with 12 guns firing 5 rounds, they had already shot out 3.5 tons of shells. The logistics support had 3 trucks dedicated to transporting ammunition. Subtracting the ammo used at Sanchi town, the remaining shells were enough for, at most, 30 rounds of fire. That was the limit of their defense. Chapter 169. Denison Henry was anxious too. He didn't know much about military matters, but he understood the simplest comparison of numbers. Perbuff's troops could fight, but they couldn't replace the role of 100,000 people. Here at the artillery positions, he was gathering the fleeing soldiers, and the effect was actually not bad. Mainly, the 12 large cannons lined up in a row were extremely intimidating. When the fleeing soldiers retreated here and saw these cannons, they couldn't help but slow down. Then, Henry would step forward, offering a carrot and stick, and keep people around. The so-called carrot was money. Henry had money, but not as much as it seemed. He had only become wealthy in the past 2 months and had made quite a bit, but he lacked accumulation. But the key was that he was now willing to spend money, even spending all his money and going into debt if necessary. After all, as long as they won and held their ground, and Rubbish Town was ultimately incorporated by the governor into the new alliance's system of governance, money wouldn't matter much anymore. This information was unknown to the ordinary adventurers. Therefore, his willingness to spend generously still had an effect. Another big stick was the policy on deserters implemented by Rubbish Town. For the adventurers who kept fleeing, Rubbish Town certainly had to come up with a measure. In fact, during this period, quite a few adventurers who had left the front line had already been executed as deserters. This pressure had somehow reached the front lines. During the Great Collapse, everyone was running, and with no officers enforcing military discipline, no one took this matter seriously. But now, with mention of heavy artillery here and the offer of double pay, the adventurers naturally had to seriously consider their choices. Of course, another key factor that could not be overlooked was that after the adventurers were reorganized, they were not sent to the front lines immediately. Having just been routed by the green Skin Orcs, sending them straight to the front line would likely have no effect. But just reforming the organizational structure and regrouping on the spot, staying beside the artillery positions without having to fight directly, was much more palatable. And by using these adventurers, they could continue to gather more adventurers, which could have an expanding effect. In a few hours, Henry had gathered around 4,000 to 5,000 adventurers. With these people, Henry began to think about sending them to the front line to fight. However, after contacting Perbuff, the answer he received was that no more people were needed, they were managing fine on their end. Mainly because the Beast Slaughter group had been reorganized. Colonel Lee Kexey, whom Henry knew, had led half the Beast Slaughter group. Behind the defensive line formed by the 1st Composite Battalion, they finally had time to properly regroup and boost their morale. They were reorganized and then deployed to the front lines, significantly reinforcing the various firepower points and relieving the manpower shortage of the 1st Composite Battalion's infantry. With that, the defense line of about 6 kilometers in the 5th District could be considered impregnable. The difficulty lay in the rest of the battlefront, which was about 50 kilometers long. The Greenskins had quieted down in the face of the 1st Battalion, but they could strike at other positions at any time. In fact, this situation was likely already occurring. But what was worse was that neither Henry nor Perbuff had a good grasp of the overall situation. The army, composed of freelance adventurers bands, even chose which defensive line they were responsible for by themselves, self-selecting their tasks. They didn't even have a unified command structure. Despite their great numbers, many thought more about adventuring, scavenging, and making money rather than fighting the greenskins. Teams without contracts weren't even considering confronting the enemy head-on, consequently, their enormous numbers couldn't exert their full strength. But at least, Swan should have an understanding of the overall situation. He reached out again to the rubbish town magnate, partly to find out the current state of the battle and if any areas needed support. The 3,000 to 5,000 men he had gathered could temporarily hold the line, though their combat effectiveness shouldn't be overestimated. On the other hand, he was more eager to know whether the issue of numerous adventurers' bands, either choosing for themselves or being hired away by other vacillating merchants and agents to protect those fleeing bugs, had been contained or not. I am about to address this problem. After ending the communication with Henry, Swan wore a solemn expression as he pushed open the door of the meeting room in front of him. Inside, quite a few people were already seated. His influence was evident at this time. Without him, no one could have gathered so many agents and important merchants together during such chaos, with many considering abandoning everything to flee. But that was as far as it went. The meeting hall was noisy, and many faces showed clear signs of impatience. Their arguments were routine, having been debated many times in the past. There were those who advocated for holding out, and others for giving up. Even among those who wanted to hold out, opinions varied. Some were calling for the establishment of a unified rubbish town army to end the disarray, some suggested stricter supervision of the adventurer groups and more rational task distribution with increased rewards. Chapter 170. Swan had actually eavesdropped for quite a while before entering the room. The situation of the argument was pretty much as he had understood before. Most people still wanted to continue holding on. Even though the situation was dangerous, everyone's investments were still in Rubbish Town. On these wastelands, the value of floating wealth was very low. Currency? This thing that can't be eaten or drunk isn't the same as in a stable society where money can buy everything. In the wastelands, it was too common to have currency but not be able to buy anything. Even if it was the Alliance currency issued by the Alliance, it might not be accepted much farther afield, and its purchasing power fluctuated greatly. What was truly valuable were tangible goods, whether it was food, raw materials, or weapons and equipment. These were wealth. Another important form of wealth was industry. Industry depended on many things: machinery, locations, sources of raw materials, trade channels, business environment. Many of the people present had worked their way up to being agents because they owned industries. Giving up Revival City was tantamount to surrendering their greatest wealth. Not even seeing a coffin would necessarily bring tears, let alone without seeing one. The situation was just a bit dire now. The green Skin Orcs hadn't charged into Rubbish Town yet. Indeed, many people were unwilling to give up Rubbish Town. That would be like dispersing their wealth and breaking up the group. But on the other hand, many agents who had no fixed property and relied on transportation and channels, the traitor-type agents, wanted to flee. Although the losses from disbanding and fleeing were not small, it was still better than continuing to hold on and ending up completely collapsing and unable to escape. However, the next piece of news that Swan was about to announce could very likely change the situation. When he stepped onto the podium, the noisy and chaotic arguing gradually subsided. People began to wait for this big shot to speak, hopefully with some good news. And Swan did not disappoint them. The retreat that spread from the 18th district to the 5th district has stopped. A force from the Alliance Army in Revival City has responded to my request. They have not only plugged the holes in our defensive line but have also pushed back out 2 kilometers. Meanwhile, other units on different fronts made an orderly retreat and have now re-established a new defensive line centered around the 5th district. The situation has temporarily stabilized. This news was exhilarating. The arrival of the army belonging to Mr. Gu near Rubbish Town was known to everybody. Those who were not well informed wouldn't be able to sit in this meeting room. Someone couldn't help but ask, is Mr. Gu coming to help us? Will he resolve the trouble with those green skin beasts for us? Yes, Swan gave a confirming response. In fact, he had not had the chance to communicate with Mr. Gu, only with Henry. But that didn't prevent him from speaking confidently now. And this message, indeed, was inspiring. Anyone with clear eyes knew that the green skin crisis had spread to a point where it could not be resolved by the power of Rubbish Town alone. By bringing in Mr. Gu, who had completely taken control of Revival City, there was hope for a solution to the problem. However, some even smarter people thought of another key point. A man with dirty, tangled, blonde hair stood up and questioned Swan, What's the cost? What is the cost? Swan looked toward him. That was Nasr, his rival. The second-ranked agent in the whole of Rubbish Town. Unlike him, Nasr didn't control much in the way of physical industries. His greatest industry were the adventure groups. At least 30 large and small adventure groups active around Rubbish Town had been brought together by him through funding, sponsorship, direct organization, and other means. He controlled these adventure groups' earnings and sales channels and could directly issue tasks to those adventure groups. The 30 adventure groups, the largest with thousands of members and the smallest with dozens, collectively added up to 2 or 3 tens of thousands of armed adventurers under his influence and control. Moreover, he also had close connections with many raiders on the wastelands. This was an annoying fellow, and precisely the person Swan was most wary of during this greenskin crisis. He was the typical type with no industries, his wealth lay within those people. Even if Rubbish Town was ruined, Nasr would indeed suffer severe losses, but he could take his people and try to develop another ruin mine, or simply become a raider for some time. With a gun, there's always a way out. Facing Swan's intimidating gaze, Nasr seemed utterly unconcerned. Splitting his mouth into a grin, he revealed his yellow teeth and said, "Would Mr. Gu be so kind as to help us fight this war without asking for anything in return?" "Our dear Mr. Swan, just what exactly did you promise Mr. Gu?" His question sent the room back into silence. It's certainly good that Mr. Gu is willing to help, but one must indeed clarify what the price will be. The other various agents awaited Swan's answer. Swan revealed a smile. "The price? The entirety of Rubbish Town." With those words, the room fell silent. Even his old rival Nasr was completely thrown off balance. He tried to create difficulties for Swan, but how could you blurt out everything on your own? He had planned to press further, to clarify what specific rights over Rubbish Town Swan had sold out, wanting to embarrass him further. Unexpectedly, he heard news that left him speechless. It wasn't a matter of selling out some rights, it was the selling of the whole thing, stripped clean, with nothing left. Nasr, regaining his composure, burst out laughing. His hoarse, unpleasant laugh sounded incredibly shrill. "You sold the entire Rubbish Town to Mr. Gu? What right do you have to do that? Is Rubbish Town yours alone?" In the face of the accusations, Swan wore an indifferent smile. "Let me correct you on one point, it's not selling out but a price," Swan said. "Whether Mr. Gu chooses to save Rubbish Town and what he asks as a price, do you think those are decisions I can make?" "What do you mean? Let me be even clearer." Swan continued, "Mr. Gu believes that Rubbish Town is already part of the Alliance, and as the ruler of the entire planet, it is only right that he would rule Rubbish Town and rightfully incorporate it into the new Alliance system. It's just that Rubbish Town happens to be facing a huge crisis, under the threat of Skin Orcs. He is coming to help his own people." Swan emphasized the word helping his people heavily. Many understood his implication and fell into thought. Others either did not understand or refused to accept it even if they did. Nasr continued to make noise. "What gives him the right to do that? Do our 100,000 people, our 100,000 guns, mean nothing? Those factories, those industries, they are our property. How can he just take them because he's Mr. Gu?" Some, confused, joined in the commotion. Swan just looked at them and let out a cold snort, not saying much else. Gradually, some began to understand and gradually fell silent. Finally, Nasr's face turned sour. His supporters were no longer numerous. Clenching his rotten teeth, he said to Swan, "Are you intending to wipe us out completely?" "I never said that," Swan retorted. "I'm taking my people and leaving. Right now," Nasr declared. Finally, Swan smiled, a radiant smile. "That's not going to work. We are in a state of emergency. The battle outside the city has not yet ended, the threat of the Skin Orcs is still severe, and with Mr. Gu's imminent arrival, I propose that, effective immediately, Rubbish Town enters a state of emergency, the entire town under martial law, with no one allowed in or out." Following procedure, Swan's proposal should go to a vote, but today, he didn't ask for those in favor to raise their hands. Instead, he asked for the opponents to raise theirs. Nasr shouted in opposition, and a minority roared angrily with him. But it was to no avail as the majority maintained an eerie silence. With a smile, Swan announced, "Then from this moment on, Rubbish Town is officially under martial law." Chapter 171 Henry had already learned about the recent events in Rubbish Town. He was also an agent, the meeting should have provided a place for him. Being busy outside, one of his subordinates had to attend in his stead. His subordinate had informed him of the situation and was one of those who had kept quiet at the time. Martial law was of course a good thing, preventing the situation from further deterioration, preventing those agents and traitors from fleeing with supplies and a large number of adventurers. If it lasted too long, it would surely become uncontrollable. Rubbish Town, lacking a centralized power structure, didn't support the continuation of such strict policies for long. But despite that, he still felt it was somewhat miraculous. When he re-established communication with Swan, he couldn't wait to ask, was the martial law order really passed so easily? Ha, do you think it was easy? Although he said this, Swan's voice was steady, yet with a hint of pride. I had contacted many agents close to me who have industries in Rubbish Town in advance. Past, that's how it had such an effect. Henry noticed a subtle shift in Mr. Swan's attitude towards him. The personage, whose status was far above his own, seemed to be trying to befriend him, and the tone of his speech was attempting to become more intimate. It wasn't exactly flattering, but at least it was an overture of friendship. It was because he had aligned himself with the governor before Swan did that Mr. Swan needed to befriend him, to make it easier to speak in the future. Thinking of all the twists and turns involved, Henry couldn't help feeling somewhat smug. Curbing this minor smugness, Henry continued with the previous topic. Then, wouldn't this push Nasr into a corner, making him desperate? There's that possibility. Swan said, but the situation should be controllable. How so? Those agents with industries should oppose it when they hear that the governor wants to reclaim the whole of Rubbish Town and implement the new alliance system here. Their industries will be repossessed, right? On the contrary, it would seem that those without fixed assets would be relatively less opposed to the governor. Swan, unusually patient, explained the situation in Rubbish Town. It seems that way on the surface, but with your intelligence, you should think deeper. We who have assets are truly the ones who cannot run. If we run, what else do we have? Nothing. We don't have enough resources or even enough people to obey our commands. Attempting to become raiders would only make us a minor force. Even if the governor confiscates all assets when he comes, I've carefully examined your policies. Those assets, once repossessed, won't just be abandoned, will they? They would need to be restarted. And we who once owned them, at least understand these industries, so why couldn't we switch from being business owners to factory managers? As a manager, according to the 45 level rating, that should be higher than that of an ordinary worker or clerk, right? Being a manager who has to report to the so-called Alliance Production Department, and doesn't own the produced goods, certainly isn't as satisfying as being a real owner. But your policies can guarantee a lower limit, allowing people to live a steady, decent life. Believe me, just that is enough to attract quite a few agents who don't want to live in constant fear. Moreover, what room do we have to refuse? Either Rubbish Town is destroyed and becomes nothing, or one goes from being an agent to a factory manager, a member of the management staff. Many people would make this choice. On the other hand, those without assets are the ones who cannot accept the arrival of the governor. After the governor arrives, will he continue to allow large numbers of armed forces to remain in their control? Once all production is allocated by the new alliance government, can they still profit from buying and selling goods? Taking the chance with enough manpower while one still can, having guns and people, where can't they carve out a domain for themselves? Even as raiders, they would be the leaders, living luxuriously, with people at their command. They are the ones who are least willing to stay within the governor's system. Henry listened thoughtfully. Swan paused, with more to say. For us, the proprietors, the only real point of concern is the situation of those who had assets in the past in Revival City. Many are most afraid of surrendering their assets, only to be liquidated in the end, as was the case with the large executions before the governor's speech in Revival City. Frankly, that set a very bad precedent. Our governor took harsh measures to quickly take control of the city, but it was a very, very bad start. With these words, Swan revealed his stance and concerns to Henry, who had clearly sided with the governor. Henry also understood that he was seeking assurances from the governor through himself. But this insurance? Henry felt he couldn't provide it. And he didn't need to provide it. He responded, if you really understood the situation of those who were executed back then, you would know they got what they deserved. They killed the old council president Hodgson, who had supported the governor. They tried to violently prevent the governor from entering Revival City, they colluded with the cult. For these crimes, they deserved to die. The situation is different between Rubbish Town and Revival City. If you can bring the whole city under the governor's command and actively help the governor restore production afterward, without hatching any more schemes, then why should you worry about those baseless concerns? Chapter 172. Having heard these words, Swan stood by the window, unsure whether he had gotten what he wanted or not. Indeed, he felt somewhat at ease, but not completely. After all, there had been no formal guarantee. But to have come this far was probably the limit. The call ended, and Swan stood by the window, full of ambition. His office was perched at the highest point of Rubbish Town. Looking down, his feelings were complicated. In the past, he had always strived to climb higher and higher. Once he reached the top, he extended his hand, wanting to grab more and more. He wanted to be the master of Rubbish Town. At one point, when the green Skin Orcs brought severe harm to Rubbish Town and Henry said that the governor intended to completely reclaim it, he thought his dream was going to shatter. But now, it seemed that he could achieve this goal from another angle. After all, Rubbish Town was 200 kilometers away from Revival City. If he did well, could he become the mayor of Rubbish Town? As the highest administrative official, to some extent, it seemed he could fulfill his old desire. Previously, to become the master of Rubbish Town, he had to fight against heaven and earth, figuring out ways to compete with those who didn't follow his path, yet this time, it might be an opportunity. The governor would help him sweep away those damned things, and he could then become the boss in this clean house. It couldn't be anything but a good thing. Once the governor arrived, he needed to put on a sufficient performance. He had to ensure proper logistics support, proper restructuring of the adventurers, proper inventory and transfer of the overall industry of Rubbish Town. These things had to be done perfectly. Thinking of many specific action plans, he momentarily got lost in thought. A series of footsteps from behind brought him back to reality. Turning around, he saw a rather handsome young man dressed in a grey combat uniform. That was Mark Ferry, his confidant, whom he had promoted to help him manage the most crucial armed force under his command, the Clock Iron Blade Adventurer Group. "Boss, the martial law order has been carried out." "Good." Swan's voice regained the indifference he always showed to others. He was always like this, keeping a distance from people. In his view, a sense of distance was one of the key points to maintaining mystique and authority, especially towards his subordinates. As usual, Ferry should have just left after getting a good from him. But today, things didn't seem to be quite the same. Ferry hesitated for a moment, then continued, "Nasr won't let things go, he's mobilizing the adventurers he can control who are still in town. There might be conflict later." Swan frowned and looked at Ferry. "Isn't that what I've told you before? He surely won't let things go, but he has no chance. I've had people cut off the communication lines with the front line, now only I can contact the front line, cutting off his ability to call people back. The armed forces he can mobilize in Rubbish Town definitely do not exceed 10,000 men, while my Clock Iron Blade has returned, with 3,000 well-equipped men. Blockade the town, no need to kill them, just hold until the governor arrives, and we win." "Yes, if the governor arrives, we win," Ferry echoed, "but what about us?" "Just now." "Boss, you were talking to Denison Henry, right? Did he give you any assurances?" "He did, I will be Rubbish Town's master in the future." Swan didn't want to tell the whole truth, but he felt what he said was the truth. He would be the master of Rubbish Town, he believed it. "And what about us?" Ferry pressed. "You." Swan turned around, looking Ferry up and down as if seeing him for the first time. "Yes, us." Swan broke into a broad smile, "You'll be fine." Then he added, "No need to fight anymore, you can put down your guns. Factories need workers, stores need waiters, and Ruin Mine also needs scavengers. Although scavenging should no longer be risky by then, as the governor would have cleaned up those mines. Of course, if you still want to be a soldier, that's fine too. The governor's army will continue to recruit, and with your experience, enlisting should land you a good position. In short, life will definitely get much better then." "Yes, life will get better then." While Mark Ferry said this, he pulled out his gun without hesitation. Swan, who had sensed something was off with the young man just now, had already heightened his alertness. He quickly drew his own handgun. But he was too slow. He was no longer the young man who fought bravely on the front lines with his brothers. His gun, while exquisitely made with intricate patterns, was more like a work of art than a weapon. The bullet found him first, hitting his neck with precision. He toppled backward uncontrollably, followed by several more bullets aimed at his head, neck, and heart. It wasn't until the magazine was completely empty that Mark Ferry slowly put down the gun. Looking at Swan, who lay on the ground twitching, he said softly, "Boss, you would have been Rubbish Town's master when the governor came, but the governor doesn't need people like me. I would only be left to work as a laborer or a scavenger, to start over as a soldier, which doesn't seem fair. Even if you lied to me about a better future, I would have believed you. But you weren't even willing to do that, don't blame me." Chapter 173. Having said that, he withdrew his gaze and turned away. A dozen minutes later, he met NASR in another part of Rubbish Town. NASR, who had been pacing restlessly, stopped in his tracks upon seeing Mark Ferry. After staring at him for several seconds, he suddenly burst out with a smile, "I was torn between wanting to see you and fearing it, but now I'm sure, I wanted to see you. You've got it, haven't you?" "Yes." "Fantastic. That old ghost Swan. Despicable for trying to kill us all to achieve his dream of becoming the Lord of Rubbish Town. Good riddance." Mark Ferry, however, did not want to dwell on the topic. "We're short on time, I don't have the leisure, nor the opportunity to clean all of Clockwork Iron blades," and according to Swan, many wealthy agents supported him. "The best chance to leave is now. We must hurry, taking advantage of the chaos created by Swan's death." "You're right." NASR laughed heartily, wrapping an arm around Mark Ferry's shoulder. "Let's go. We'll leave right away. From here on out, we'll be as free as the eagles above the yellow sands. We will hunt for whatever we want to eat. Who wants to be a dog to some governor? Our prey will be those who are willing to be sheep, to be dogs. From now on, Ferry, you're my best brother and our most important leader. If there's ever only one piece of meat left, I'd rather starve myself and let you have it first." Chaos engulfed Rubbish Town. The death of Swan had already spread on a small scale. The troops enforcing martial law were mostly adventurers, with Clockwork Iron blades at the core, supported by the teams of adventurers hired by other agents. But with Swan dead and Mark Ferry, the commander of the Clockwork Iron blades, suspected of betrayal, the Clockwork Iron blades were left temporarily brain dead. Some of the remaining officers disappeared. They had fled with Ferry. Others were panicked and clueless, with only a few resolutely carrying out the martial law. As for the other wealthy agents, for the time being, they were all unable to choose someone to take temporary control. When the thousands, nearly 10,000, that NASR had gathered started to move, and fired without hesitation at anyone who blocked their exit from Rubbish Town, they virtually became the only organized large-scale team within Rubbish Town. They became unstoppable. At the beginning of the breakout, NASR and Mark Ferry were still tense, fearing further twists. But as the vanguard managed to break out and they with the main force stepped through the gates of Rubbish Town, both involuntarily relaxed. Breaking away from Rubbish Town and heading for the vast wastelands became certain. But just at that moment, they noticed the pace of the column had slowed. The crowd ahead of their vehicle had grown dense, and people began to shrink back, afraid to move forward. NASR, too, sensed something was wrong. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and bellowed, "What's the matter? What's happening up front?" There was only a hiss of static from the walkie-talkie, not a single useful message. After a long wait, just as NASR was about to impatiently ask again, a message finally came back: Nov. L. B //JNN. The governor has arrived. NASR felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over his head. Why would the governor come? Wasn't there supposed to be at least 3 more days? At this moment, from the walkie-talkie in his hand, another voice came through, "What now, what do we do?" NASR was stunned, and for a moment, he truly did not know what to do. But Mark Ferry, standing beside him, seemed very decisive. He snatched the walkie-talkie from NASR's hand and yelled, "Open fire! Command the vanguard to open fire! Have everyone ready to break out!" "No." Ferry glared angrily at NASR, who had instinctively denied his words. "What are you thinking? We've come this far, is there any room for hesitation now?" NASR was almost grinding his rotten teeth to pieces. "Can't fight, can't win. You're fucking realizing now we can't win." Mark Ferry was furious, half turning and grabbing NASR by the collar. almost pressing face to face as he continued to roar, "I've been with the old boss for so many years and you're fucking telling me now we can't win." Nasr was frightened by the governor and by the ferocious face of Mark Ferry at this moment. He stretched out his hand, forcefully blocking between himself and Ferry. Now we can only split the team, flee in all directions. However many can get out, that's how many. And then regroup safely later." Hearing this, Ferry seemed to calm down all of a sudden. He let go and asked, "How many people do you estimate can escape? And how much time will it take to regroup our forces?" "Definitely a lot can get out." Nasr rapidly calculated in his head, "The governor is eager to take over Rubbish Town, as long as we don't cause him too much trouble, he won't pursue us full force. Some people will die, but not many. Once we're out, with my call to arms, everyone will quickly come together again, and by then you'll still be the big boss." Before he could finish, gunfire erupted inside the vehicle. Unconsciously, Ferry had drawn his pistol and fired several shots at Nasr's stomach. His other hand was tightly choking Nasr's neck. Staring at Nasr's rather ugly face, he said, "You still want to deceive me at this point? If we really scatter and run, do you think you can just call everyone back together? When the wasteland is full of little marauder tribes, why would anyone with guns and people listen to you? I fought my way out to be the top dog, not to be some small-time chieftain in a tiny tribe. I hate being lied to the most." He had completely forgotten what he had said to Swan when he was facing death. Taking a long breath, he realized the walkie-talkie beside him was still on. But he didn't care about that anymore, picked up the walkie-talkie and yelled to the other side, "Get everyone ready. We're going to gather our forces. Focus on one direction to break out. Only by concentrating can we have a way out. Now I'm the boss, listen to me." There was silence on the other end of the walkie-talkie, no response at all. In Nasr's team, he had just joined, with neither direct lineage nor prestige. It was not as simple as killing the former boss and claiming to be the boss to actually become the boss. Chapter 174. The current state of Rubbish Town, and the many emotional entanglements that had just unfolded, were unknown to Gu Hang. The latest news he received still came from Denison Henry. According to the intelligence, Jason Swan, Rubbish Town's most important agent, should have confirmed that he would try his best to lead the entire town to submission. There were indeed resistance forces within the town, but they would enforce martial law, locking up those dissenters within Rubbish Town until he arrived to take over. This should be going smoothly, right? Yet, when he led his troops to the outskirts of Rubbish Town, they encountered an adventure group of over 1,000 people leaving. They looked like an advance party. At first, there was no exchange of fire, just a standoff from a fair distance apart. At this moment, Gu Hang's keen judgment told him that something might have gone wrong inside Rubbish Town. When the frontline troops came to ask what should be done, he pondered for a moment before issuing an order, "Convey my commands to those adventurers. Rubbish Town is the territory of the Alliance, and as commanded by me, should now be in a state of complete martial law. Order everyone to immediately halt their advance and retreat back to Rubbish Town to rigidly enforce martial law." Soon, Gu Hang's order was relayed to the adventurers in front by the soldiers using loudspeakers. This statement left the adventurers feeling very hesitant. Just retreat because they say so? What about the ruckus they had stirred up in front? A military parade? But if they didn't retreat, were they supposed to fight a battle with the army of the governor on the other side? The military forces that had come this time lacked the intimidating armored troops. At least the ones that appeared before them were only ordinary infantry. However, seeing the enemy's uniform black and grey military outfits, combat gear, and the firearms that seemed much more reliable than the iron pipe rifles in their hands, not to mention the far greater number of rocket launchers and machine guns. In short, the enemy was much more elite. But the warriors of the 2nd Infantry Division didn't care what those adventurers thought. The troops confronting the adventurers in the very front included 3 companies. Other troops were still marching from behind, while some spread out to the sides. The governor had to enforce martial law, and he wouldn't just do it through the megaphones. He needed sufficient power to ensure that those who disobeyed orders would have a miserable end. In fact, the entire 2nd Division was next ordered to seal off the town, making sure to fully blockade the area outside the town entrance. And as for the 3 companies tasked with the most direct confrontation, they busily got to work in front of the adventurers. Quite a few of them took out their entrenching tools and began digging foxholes on the spot. The expansive area outside Rubbish Town was an unobstructed wasteland. With relatively close proximity to each other, the officers of the three companies were quite tense. Should there be any accidental discharge, they definitely needed some form of cover. Given the urgent situation, digging trenches on the spot was clearly impractical, but any hole would be more useful than being out in the open. Even if shallow, as long as it allowed someone to lie down and reduce their exposed area, it would suffice. Their actions left the adventurers on the other side even more at a loss. Dare not fight, yet reluctant to retreat. More crucially, there was not even one person among them who could make a decisive call. Those group leaders and team leaders, unsure of what to do, heard Mark Ferry's orders from the radio, commanding them to perform an armed breakout. But the adventure group leaders didn't immediately start to act. Who are you? Should I just listen to you? Where is my boss, NASR? You, a random nobody, are telling me to lead my people to clash with the governor's obviously elite army. Am I an idiot to heed your orders? Aren't our lives valuable? Most people, in this state, still possessed some sanity. But, well, with the crowd big enough, anything could happen. Moreover, this group of adventurers was far from being as disciplined as regular armies. Whether someone was truly a fool, unconsciously following whatever orders came through the radio, or perhaps someone was simply too tense in the current situation and accidentally fired. In any case, in the wilderness, a sporadic 3 shots rang out from among the adventurers. The soldiers of the governor stationed a couple of 100 meters away, however, were unharmed. The adventurers' widely used decrepit iron pipe rifles had a maximum theoretical range that could hit beyond 500 meters, in reality, past 100 meters, they were hardly accurate, even for a marksman. These 3 bullets did the same, merely kicking up 3 patches of dust in front of the digging infantry companies. But this was a matter of principle. When the enemy used lethal arms to launch a direct attack, a counterattack became an almost inevitable option. Nearly 400 soldiers from the 3 infantry companies began retaliation at the same time. The most furious among them were over 30 squad machine guns. While digging and constructing temporary simple positions, the priority task of the 2nd Division's warriors was to get various company-level firepower deployed first. Mortars, rocket launchers, squad machine guns, all included. And the ones that got angry first were these 30-odd squad machine guns. With high firing rate, large ammunition capacity, and the firepower that burst forth in an instant, combined with the shooting from the other 300 rifles, the force inflicted significant casualties upon the adventurers right across from them in no time. Chapter 175. The iron pipe rifles in the hands of those adventurers had no accuracy at a distance of 100 or 200 meters, but the G9 rifles in the hands of the Alliance soldiers were not the same. Even at that distance, where the person seen through the iron sights was tiny, by suppressing the muzzle and carrying out precise pinpoint shooting at the general location of the enemy, there was still a certain probability of hitting the target. What's more, those nearly 2,000 people stood quite densely and had no cover to speak of. People fell in droves. And those who were still alive couldn't possibly remain indifferent at this moment. They immediately lay down and began to attempt to return fire. The 2 sides thus exchanged fire at a distance of 100 or 200 meters. The adventurers were numerous and had many guns, but not only did they suffer greater casualties, their firepower was also completely suppressed. What was the use of nearly 2,000 rifles? If they were inaccurate, they were no different from noisy fire sticks. Moreover, not only were these 2,000 rifles inaccurate, but they also severely lacked powerful suppressive firepower. In terms of the density of firepower alone, one G9C general-purpose machine gun could match 100 iron pipe rifles. The 3 infantry companies in the front also suffered casualties. There were not enough foxholes dug, and those with no place to hide could only lie down and raise their guns to exchange fire. But relatively speaking, there were far fewer deaths than on the other side. What's more, they then took out even more ferocious weapons. Rocket launchers and mortars. The 3 infantry companies together had nearly 10 mortars, plus 20 to 30 launchers. When they concentrated fire in one salvo, it brought heavy casualties to the adventurers. And the greater blow was to their morale. Having already low morale and uncertain whether they should fight at all, the fighting started mainly because a few people were not thinking clearly or due to accidental discharges, and most knew the fight was hopeless. As a result, after being forced to start the fight, they were one-sidedly suppressed by firepower, slaughtered, and indeed, as predicted earlier, they stood no chance at all. After being bombarded like this, they collapsed entirely. Some started to run. But while fearing being shot at from behind, most still lay flat and didn't dare to move much. Then they discovered that those who turned and ran really had no issues, whereas the places where no one ran and people dared to poke their heads out to counterattack, often attracted a hail of machine gun fire with mortars and rocket launchers occasionally targeting them. Then, the adventurers all started to flee en masse. From the start of the battle to the total collapse of the line, the entire process probably took less than 10 minutes. About 200 adventurers died at the front line, while the 3 infantry companies of the 2nd Division lost 2 men and had 7 or 8 injured. At the same time as this side was fighting, the troops that were setting up the blockade in other directions also encountered conflicts with those adventurers. However, the results were much the same. Gu Heng saw the situation on the front line and even felt somewhat disappointed. At 10 kilometers away, the 3 artillery battalions of the 2nd Division, along with the direct artillery support companies of the division headquarters, had already set up their artillery positions. Originally, they had planned to send over a few rounds of firepower from the more than 80 155 mm howitzers if the front line encountered any disadvantage, to give those rubbish town adventurers a little shock in terms of firepower. It seems, there was no need at all. Without even using heavy artillery, the firepower of an infantry company was already enough to settle matters. The armed adventurers, numbering well into the tens of thousands, vividly demonstrated what is meant by crumbling upon contact. They were too weak to withstand a single blow. No wonder the entire rubbish town, with its tens of thousands, was beaten into disarray by the greenskins from the ruins of the high tower. Of course, from Gu Heng's perspective of taking over rubbish town, this was a good thing. Afterward, Gu Heng thought for a moment, then called over Tadeus, who had been rapidly promoted to division commander, and issued new orders. The infantry division, having completed its blockade of rubbish town, began to gradually move inwards, shrinking the encirclement. At the same time, their loudspeakers were constantly relaying the military governor's orders to the adventurers. Lay down your weapons. Those who resist will be treated as insurgents. Lay down your weapons. Those who resist will be treated as insurgents. Under the incessant repetition, the adventurers who had witnessed the might of the military governor's forces and lacked organization and unified command surrendered en masse. As for the few who didn't surrender, they could only take their weapons and run back to hide inside rubbish town. They simply didn't have the courage to fight against the military governor's army anymore. However, hiding had become difficult. Rubbish town wasn't their turf anymore. The segments still loyal to Swan from the Clockwork Iron Blade adventurer group had previously enforced the martial law in rubbish town as an armed force. Now, they had changed roles and become the barricade preventing the adventurers from returning. After losing their boss and being betrayed by their captain, these elite few among the adventurers of Rubbish Town indeed experienced a period of chaos, but now they had regrouped. The mid-level leaders loyal to Swan had united to continue enforcing the martial law and sealed the main entrance to Rubbish Town. Revenge? There might have been a bit of that sentiment, but mainly, after clarifying the situation, they chose to stand with the victors. Following the military governor, obviously, had more prospects. Apart from the people of Clockwork Iron Blade, the other property agents still in Rubbish Town had also come together after the initial chaos. They had a hand in persuading Clockwork Iron Blade to continue following orders and even sent out some of their own direct forces to join the adventurers of Clockwork Iron Blade in barricading the town. The adventurers trying to flee back were cornered and opened fire on them. I couldn't beat the military governor's army, but you think I can't beat you? Turns out they couldn't. Clockwork Iron Blade might have been an adventurer group, but it was truly the most loyal regiment of Swan. He had spent no small sum on this troop. In terms of weaponry and training, they were stronger than the average adventurer. Breaking through their defensive line quickly wasn't so easy. With numerical superiority, they might have had a chance over more time, but these adventurers clearly didn't have enough time left. As the number of those surrendering in the back kept increasing, several companies from the 2nd Division began to quickly move forward through the gaps, reaching the rear of the adventurers who were unwilling to surrender and lay down their weapons, and started attacking them. Caught in a pincer attack, these adventurers collapsed just as swiftly. Now there was nowhere to run, they only had the choice to lay down their arms and surrender or fight to the death. Those willing to die were, of course, a very small minority. And for those rare cases, it wasn't even necessary for the Alliance soldiers to take action, their own people would find a way to resolve the issue. Among those resolved were some adventurer group captains planning to continue resisting, followers of NASR, those with a history of looting, and one particularly special individual. Mark Ferry. He was shot 3 times in the back of his head and 6 times in the back of his heart, presented by several adventurer captains during surrender, alleged to have committed suicide out of fear for his crimes. The issue outside the city was basically settled. An infantry battalion from the 2nd Division stayed behind to guard these disarmed prisoners. They would be detained en masse inside the adventurers' camp within Rubbish Town. Gu Hang, on the other hand, led the other 2 battalions into the town. Greeting him were Clockwork Iron Blade with their weapons stowed and numerous property agents. Only after entering the largest conference hall in Rubbish Town and sitting down did Gu Hang cast a lively look as the property agents rushed impatiently to pledge their loyalty to the military governor. They talked about their properties, the amount of output they could produce, they discussed the modes of production and operation in Rubbish Town, they debated the best candidate to manage these things and the qualities they should possess. Gu Hang listened absently. It wasn't until Tadeus, who still wore his bright red cap even as a division commander, pushed the door open and strode in that Gu Hang's expression became animated. These agents had indeed been the masters of Rubbish Town in the past, but as of today, they were no longer. Here in this place, the last thing Gu Hang cared about was them, it was the army, the armed adventurers. The appearance of Tadeus here meant the information he wanted had arrived. Chapter 176, New Troops. Gu Hang stood up and made a pressing down gesture with both hands. The proxies quieted down obediently. I understand the urgency in your hearts, and I believe that in the future, you will make outstanding contributions to the prosperity of Rubbish Town, he said. Hearing this speech, which set the tone, the agents felt much more at ease. With this tone set, everything would be fine for them. It meant that the governor still planned to use them, and they were not too worried about ending up like the elites in Revival City. In fact, Gu Hang did not intend to do that at all. The situations in the 2 places were different, and the property-owning proxies in Rubbish Town had not acted against him. Instead, they had quickly chosen sides and acted swiftly to help him just now. Nov. L. B/JNN. In such a situation, Gu Hang certainly did not need to conduct any major purge in Rubbish Town. He just needed to deal with the dissenters. In Revival City, where he had ordered more killings although necessary and effective in eliminating the city's incurable vices affecting governance, news of these actions reached the wasteland and indeed caused some places that would have easily submitted to experience some unrest. But Gu Hang wasn't overly concerned about these matters. It wasn't bad to face some resistance. If he were to take over fully, there were countless malignant tumors and vampires clinging to the survivor settlements in the wasteland, which would need to be dealt with after they were incorporated into the Alliance's system. After all, fighting corruption did require some evidence. It was better to resolve these issues under the guise of dealing with traitors while reclaiming territory. It was a matter of gains and losses. Governing Rubbish Town without purging would certainly be more complicated than starting almost from scratch in Revival City. The remaining proxies had intricate yet firm control over the industries that belonged to them. Corruption, the inability to fully mobilize society's productive forces, and resistance to policy innovation and promotion. These issues would probably be inevitable. However, besides the fact that they had submitted quickly and it felt wrong to punish them for it, another very important point was the pressure of the situation. The most pressing issue for Rubbish Town right now was undoubtedly not governance, but war. The threat from the green Skin Orcs was far from over. Now, Gu Hang really had no time to fuss with these proxies. Having set the tone and reassured these people, Gu Hang smoothly announced the strategy he would implement in Rubbish Town. Rubbish Town is undeniably in a state of war, and the previous lax and uncontrollable system cannot win a war. Now, I declare that Rubbish Town has fully entered a wartime system and is under military management. All productive and business activities, except for the production of necessities of life and military goods manufacturing, are suspended. All residents of Rubbish Town must remain at home, and the city is in full lockdown. All essential goods for the residents will be distributed by the Military Logistics Department under the command of Colonel Tadeus. The proxies who heard Gu Hang's announcement looked at each other, bewildered. Such strict management had never been seen in Rubbish Town before, and they appeared lost. Some instinctively felt that this was not right. But no one dared to speak up. Gu Hang paused and continued, "Just now, I had someone record everything you said. Each of you is in charge of an industry and the people dependent on those industries. You need to help manage them. You will temporarily work in the Military Logistics Department to assist Colonel Tadeus and maintain order in the town. Your performance during this time will determine what treatment you will receive after Rubbish Town has settled down. I guarantee that if your job ranking reaches C5 or even above B, your personal income and standard of living will be better than before, and the power you hold will also be greater. It seemed to be another reassurance to them. These proxies, who had previously planned to turn to the governor, had gained some understanding of the policies implemented by the new alliance in Revival City. They knew that currently, no one in Revival City had received an A-tier treatment, those who were getting B-tier treatment were very few. If an E-tier treatment is considered the poverty line, D-tier treatment already represented the good life many in the wasteland could only dream of. One would have to be a technical worker, a professional, or a lower to mid-level manager to receive this level of treatment. C-tier treatment was reserved for senior government officials with commendable achievements, top factory managers, and senior technical experts in their fields. According to the governor, if they worked hard, they even had the chance to reach B-tier ranking. It was said that Lady Asana of Revival City, who was actually just a minister, currently had a ranking of B3. Of course, they were sober enough to realize that the governor's words were not just reassurance but also a tantalizing promise. The promise was tempting, but achieving it wouldn't be easy. But at least there was something to look forward to. Seeing that the proxies were getting excited, Gu Hang also showed a smile. With the help of these influential figures, things would indeed be much easier. Wartime system, military control, material allocation. With these three aces in hand, Gu Hang was no longer anxious about maintaining order in Rubbish Town. Chapter 177. This part of the work, he had almost completely handed over to Tadeus. The commander of the 2nd Infantry Division had hardly had any direct involvement in military command since the beginning of the battle, nor was he likely to in the upcoming conflicts. But his responsibilities were clearly much more important than those of a mere military commander. And Gu Hang believed he would do well. After all, he was the only SR-level talent under his command. Once Gu Hang had ensured that there would be no major issues with the city's order, he immediately shifted his attention to military matters. The threat of the green Skin Orcs was far from over. The 2 regiments of the 2nd Infantry Division had only rested in the town for one night before they had to set off again. To be honest, they were exhausted. From Revival City to Rubbish Town, what was normally a 6 to 7 day march, Gu Hang led his troops to arrive in less than 4 days. Marching 100 li a day, most of the troops had come by foot, and by the time they reached the outskirts of Rubbish Town, many had already reached their physical limits, only to have to fight another battle before they could enter. It was lucky that this battle was easy to fight, as the adventurers' will to fight was very weak, they shattered upon contact. Otherwise, it would have been a bit troublesome. Although they had rested for only one night and were about to head to the front lines, there was no alternative. Just during that very night, Perbuff at the front line had already sent multiple pieces of bad news. Once the green Skin Orcs knew that the defences built by the 1st Regiment of the 1st Brigade were tough, they quickly changed their direction of attack and began assaulting other positions. At the moment, the adventurers still fighting on the front lines numbered just over 50,000. Many teams that had been routed and retreated were still reorganizing and had yet to return to the front. The defense line they had formed was full of gaps, forcing Perbuff to deploy 2 mechanized infantry companies to put out fires along the entire front that stretched over 60 kilometers. In the ruins of the high tower, the terrain was much more complicated than in the wilderness. Even though the engineering corps had tried to clear a convenient route for support, there were often times when help couldn't arrive in time. There had even been instances where the enemy had breached the defences and a significant number of green Skin Orcs had infiltrated, ambushing the teams as they moved to support. If it hadn't been for the Strider Type V walking tanks in the companies, which were truly powerful, a major disaster could have occurred. In essence, Perbuff simply didn't have enough men at his disposal, and he couldn't directly command all of the adventurer squads, which made his manpower seem clumsy and inadequate along the tens of kilometers long battle line. The 1st Regiment and Division headquarters of the 2nd Division stayed in Rubbish Town to suppress civil disorder, while the 2nd and 3rd Regiments, these 2 infantry regiments totaling nearly 4,000 men, took over the front line. A unified command center was established in Rubbish Town, where all the Alliance Army forces, including those adventurers, would receive orders from here and carry out their military tasks. With these 4,000 regular troops, the problem at the front line could be somewhat alleviated. Moreover, what was more important was the 3 artillery battalions along with the direct fire support from the division headquarters. Counting Perbuff's own artillery, there were altogether over 100 cannons. The artillery was dispersed across many positions, with a range of about 20 kilometers, to cover the 60-kilometer-long position as much as possible, hoping that whenever the front line needed support, the artillery could immediately strike. And this time, the logistics were reliable. 30 supply trucks that came with the 2nd Division were specially brought to transport artillery shells, a total of 4,500 rounds of heavy artillery ammunition. This involved almost the entire stock of artillery shells from Revival City, in addition to all the production capacity from Wuxing City over the past half-month, which had been almost completely transported here. But in reality, they still needed to be conservative with their use. It was only enough for 100 cannons to fire a few dozen rounds each, after all. If they fired these heavy artillery pieces as if they were free, providing full fire coverage, they would be expended in 2 hours. However, the logistics vehicles had already started their return journey, and the military-industrial complex in Wuxing City had been ordered to work at full capacity. The production of all kinds of ammunition and bullets would be of paramount importance in the time to come. Moreover, new military production lines were already being built. When there were enough people and raw materials, increasing production capacity wasn't a big issue. Even so, this could only be said to ease the situation at the front line. 4,000 men were still not enough to fill a 60-kilometer-long front line. The 2 regiments, assisted by some of the armed adventurers who were still at the front line, could actually only be responsible for about 10 kilometers of the line each. There were still a lot of gaps. Not to mention, this was only for defense. What about offense? Artillery could indeed cause terrible casualties to any green skin orcs daring to attack. But when it came to advancing with the enemy having defensive fortifications, relying solely on bombardment wouldn't suffice, especially in a city ruins environment. Once the green skin orcs hid in the ruins, with cover and fortifications everywhere, the killing power of the artillery would be greatly reduced. Even tanks and armored vehicles might not fare well in the terrain of the ruins. One shouldn't be misled by Perbuff's reports from previous battles, where 2 armored vehicles, a tank, and 2 infantry squads managed to eliminate 30 to 50 green skin orcs with the casualty of only 5 to 10 men, but that was in defensive combat. Try attacking? The whole battle situation was more akin to urban street fighting. In the end, even after the artillery barrage, it all came down to soldiers going in. Chapter 178. Can we make do with just the 2nd Infantry Division? It's a bit difficult. The combat environment in the urban ruins can easily pull you into engagements within dozens of meters, even face-to-face. Even for T5 regular soldiers, they are at a complete disadvantage against greenskin orcs. The greenskins on the other side might number nearly 10,000. If it's an offensive operation, even if we were to expend the entire 2nd Division, I'm afraid it wouldn't be enough. In such a situation, Gu Hang had 2 strategies in mind. The problem lies in firepower and troop numbers, right? Then, we simply have to address these 2 issues. In terms of firepower, the 155 howitzers' firepower is indeed the strongest Gu Hang can offer under conventional forces. It's more than enough for defensive operations but indeed not effective enough to completely annihilate the greenskins hiding in the ruins during an offensive. But besides the firepower at his own disposal, Gu Hang could also ask for external support. If the 155 howitzer isn't sufficient, what about the colossal cannon, whose caliber is beyond description? An orbital strike from space can provide considerable firepower support. And the second problem, that of troop strength. The regular army under Gu Hang's command indeed isn't enough to cope with this war, at most sufficient to maintain the front but incapable of advancing. However, those adventurers active on the battlefield are a good pool of manpower. Right now, they might look pathetic, with shoddy equipment, lousy discipline, disorganized, uneven training levels, and low morale. But under the baptism of the dog tag system, issues of discipline, organization, and training level can be resolved. The morale problem, that's somewhat troublesome. But fortunately, Tadeusz had prepared in advance by nurturing some candidates for unit political commissars, reserved for enhanced troop recruitment. Before the Loyal Air Academy was established, the temporary political commissars pulled together weren't very reliable. Even though they had a bit more training time than the ones allocated to the Old Alliance Legion right after the conquest of Revival City, these armies composed of adventurers could be ideologically even worse than the Old Alliance army. The former at least used to be regular troops, while the latter are just too varied. We can only hope that the training effectiveness of the dog tag panel and the methods of allocating political commissars can raise their standards as much as possible. As for the level of equipment, there is a preliminary solution. Gu Hang certainly anticipated the situation in Rubbish Town. The supply trucks from the logistics department, aside from carrying enough logistics supplies including ammunition, shells, and rations, also brought 5,000 sets of individual soldier equipment, along with associated company and platoon-level weapons such as machine guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. Gu Hang planned to first conscript 5,000 people from this group of adventurers to form an enhanced group. This force's source of troops was also already targeted by Gu Hang. Beast Slaughter Group. There were two reasons. Among the adventurer teams in Rubbish Town, if he had to say which team he could somewhat approve of, it would be the one called the Beast Slaughter Group. This statement originated from Prabhu's report. The other reason he set his sights on this group was because he saw a slight flicker in the event's interface on the system screen. After opening it, Gu Hang saw an activatable event. Event activated, Green Skin Threat. The green skin orcs that mysteriously appeared on the planet have grown into a threat that cannot be ignored in just a few years. Just as they were about to destroy Rubbish Town, your troops arrived at the scene. Yet the danger was not eliminated, as the green skins attack continued. Phase 1 objective: defend Rubbish Town, ensuring that it remains under your control until the green skin orcs retreat. Event reward: T5 level additional troop training option. Beast Slaughter Group. Beast Slaughter Group, a specifically trained infantry unit, for soldiers who have completed T5 level training and can undergo further specialized training against the green skin orcs to become the Beast Slaughter Group. Troops of the Beast Slaughter Group have mastered combat experience and techniques against enemies like the greenskins, and under a mysterious blessing, have a slight enhancement in physical condition when fighting the greenskins. Training price: every 1 point of grace per 100 people. Note, there is a special force that, despite a severe lack of equipment, has learned some unique skills from long-term confrontations with the greenskin orcs, possessing the potential to become a Beast Slaughter Group. Once they are trained into a T5 level or higher force, they will automatically gain the characteristic of the additional troop type Beast Slaughter Group. This message sparked a strong interest in Gu Hang for the Beast Slaughter Group. Firstly, the event itself. The activation of an event by fighting the greenskins was somewhat unexpected to him, but it was definitely a good thing. It was different from the Phoenix Will Die event. The chain of events for the Phoenix Battle Group could have been irrelevant to him, but it ended up being directed towards him. However, events like that one require spending points of grace to activate. But now, his actions triggered the event, which meant there was no need to spend additional points of grace. Activating an event was certainly good news. The defense of Rubbish Town was a battle that had to be fought. Having an event accompany it effectively meant additional rewards. Moreover, the objective of the event largely aligned with Gu Hang's plan, defending before considering attacking. The preparations for a counterattack were far from ready, and since there were advantages to defending, it made sense to focus on defense first. The greenskins colliding with a prepared defense line, suffering heavy losses, was ideal. Gu Hang wanted to turn this defensive line into a meat grinder, depleting as much of the greenskins' forces as possible. As for the reward for the event, it was a pleasant surprise to Gu Hang. An additional troop type, this was a new mechanism. Did it mean that after T1 T5 level training of troops, additional grace points could be spent on special training to create special troop types? The characteristic of the Beast Slaughter Group was closely related to the current war. If every soldier gained the Beast Slaughter Group characteristic, the advantage against the greenskin orcs, a monstrous enemy, could be further amplified. Not to mention the details mentioned in the event note. A special force with the potential to become Beast Slaughter Group, if not the Beast Slaughter Group itself, then what? According to the notes, as long as the force at the front lines calling themselves the Beast Slaughter Group was trained to T5 level, they would automatically possess the Beast Slaughter characteristic. That adventurous group had about 6,000 people, which equated to Gu Hang saving 60 points of grace that would have been spent on additional training. And conveniently, Gu Hang had an extra 5,000 sets of individual equipment, which he could first allocate to arm them. Forming the first group from adventurers, and reorganizing them into a team, was also quite fitting. Chapter 179. Lucy Lee Koxi received the order to withdraw for rest and reorganization. Since being saved by the Alliance Army and fighting alongside them with his brothers, 2 days had passed. These 2 days had been tough. Knowing that the 6 to 7 kilometers of the front line in the 5th district were hard to overcome, those greenskins tried to break through elsewhere. And his Beast Slaughter Group had also withstood the pressure of the greenskin assaults from surrounding directions. Had it not been for the artillery support from the Alliance and the swift-moving armored vehicles sent by Captain Prabhu, even if they could have held their ground, the casualties would have been heavy. But however tough life was, it was still better than before. At least, there was a war to fight. It was true his brothers suffered heavy casualties, but seeing those greenskins dying under the barrage of gunfire and artillery, he felt that the sacrifice was not without value. And for this reason, he was actually reluctant to receive the order instructing his troops to withdraw for rest and reorganization. In his view, aside from those alliance forces, no one could fight better than his men. If his 5,000 or 6,000 men conducted an organized retreat, the front line might not hold. However, what happened next made him hold his tongue. The replacement troops belonged to the Alliance Army. They were from the 2nd Infantry Division's 3rd Regiment, taking over his defense line. Despite the 3rd Regiment having less than half of his troops' numbers, barely 2,000 men, and lacking armored cars or tanks, they brought 30 pieces of heavy artillery. Well, indeed you are more formidable. Moreover, while he wanted to fight, his subordinates were beginning to struggle mentally. He could only depart with his troops in reluctant acceptance. Before leaving, he met with Prabhupada once more, mainly to express his gratitude. It wasn't just for saving their lives, but for saving his whole team as well. Had it not been for Prabhu's troops arriving in time, following his death, the demoralized beast slaughter group would likely have dispersed. Prabhu accepted Li Kexi's thanks with composure. Afterwards, the two of them discussed the current state of the war situation and exchanged views on the beast slaughter group being called back. Prepare yourself, as the governor might be looking to incorporate your forces, Prabhu advised. Incorporate? Li Kexi furrowed his brow, instinctively resistant to the idea. Why incorporate? Isn't it quite good as it is? We already fully obey the commands from the governor's headquarters established at Rubbish Town. It's more than that, in the future, you'll become proper soldiers of the Alliance Army, Prabhu explained. I don't really want that. Before, there were many agents, even Mr. Swan, who wanted us to follow orders completely, all of whom we refused. It doesn't quite align with the original intention of establishing this group, Li Kexi replied. Prabhu shook his head. Whether you accept incorporation is your decision, but I strongly recommend you accept it. He said, holding up 2 fingers, I'll give you 2 reasons to consider carefully. Firstly, Rubbish Town won't offer the space for mercenary groups to survive as in the past, everything will definitely become regulated. You have to think about the future for your brothers. Do you really intend to die here for revenge? Or even after getting revenge, and exterminating those greenskins, then just stop living? Being incorporated is the best option. Enjoy military provisions, allowances. Just train well, carry out orders, and don't worry about anything else. There's even a generous pension in case of death, and future retirement will be properly arranged, ensuring security for the rest of your lives. Secondly, even if we only consider the present and how to fight the greenskins, incorporation is better. You're the most formidable adventurers against greenskins, but true encounters still cost the lives of 3 or 5 of your men to take down one of them. After incorporation, you'll get direct weapons and equipment support, which will greatly assist you in killing those greenskins. Having said this, Prabhu put down his fingers and indeed said no more. And Li Kexi, who had initially been resistant, found no arguments to counter Prabhu's 2 points. After parting ways with Prabhu, Li Kexi led his troops to retreat towards the rear. After half a day's march, they reached the Alliance Army's camp. This was a new rear army camp, now accommodating nearly 40,000 people. The personnel distribution of the 100,000 adventurers from Rubbish Town was approximately as follows: 10,000 were locked up in a prison camp in the West District of Rubbish Town, where starvation was the least of their concerns. This group had tried to escape with Nasr and Mark Ferry. 40,000 were in the Alliance Army camp, mostly adventurers who had broken ranks on the front line days ago. After retreating, they reorganized, were resupplied with ammunition, and received rest and reorganization right there. 50,000 were maintaining the front lines. In the Alliance camp, after 2 days of rest, the headquarters began rotating the troops. It was difficult to count on these unevenly skilled adventurers to endure the hardships and casualties of frontline combat indefinitely. Rotating troops was more reliable than throwing all 100,000 into the fray at once. Of course, the most important thing to maintain their morale was money. They were adventurers, mercenaries, and they fought for money. Gu Heng undoubtedly issued alliance currency to them generously, also promising that this currency could be spent in Rubbish Town during the war. He managed to procure a considerable amount of supplies from within Rubbish Town. Furthermore, he promised that those who continued to stay within the alliance after the war and reforms could exchange the alliance currency they currently received for labor points. Chapter 180. It seemed like a significant expense, but in reality, the costs weren't as high as imagined. It was just Alliance currency, and much of it was just promissory notes. What's the use of issuing Alliance currency? If adventurers spend it immediately, they're spending the savings that Gu Hang pulled together from various places in Rubbish Town. If they hoard it without spending, it represents future redemption. Truthfully, if one wanted to be nasty, it would be easy to talk about integration into the Alliance system and converting to work points in the future. For those who want to leave and cash out their Alliance currency, you don't get to set the price of goods anymore. Of course, Gu Hang wouldn't do this unless absolutely necessary, as it would be quite damaging to his reputation. Gu Hang still hoped that these people would be able to stay in the future. Even if they didn't remain soldiers, transforming into workers would still mean a population of 100,000. And among these people, Gu Hang valued the Beast Slaughter group the most. After they retreated for rest and reorganization, Gu Hang called for a meeting with the leader of the Beast Slaughter group, Lucy Li Koxi. Faced with Gu Hang's proposition of integration, Li Kexi ultimately chose to accept. On the way back, he had a thorough discussion with his brothers. From the team leaders, to the mid-level commanders, even the lower-ranking soldiers, he asked for many opinions. The words they used were different, but the sentiment was nearly the same: they were willing to be integrated. What more was there to say? Ever since the Beast Slaughter group was formed, they had been fighting for half a year. Constant death, constant sacrifice, living conditions harsh beyond measure. Hatred was what drove them, but another fact could not be ignored. They were originally a group of adventurers who, aside from this, didn't know what else to do. Revenge was a motivator, surviving on just that, perhaps an even greater one. What was so bad about being integrated? Life could be better, the future more secure, and it wouldn't impede their fight against the green Skin Orcs. As for maintaining independence, it was indeed one of the initial tenets of the Beast Slaughter group, only accepting sponsorship and not orders, but that was for the sake of focusing on fighting green Skin Orcs, to avoid being sent on private jobs by the agents in Rubbish Town. Now, Rubbish Town had been turned on its head, the situation completely different. Continuing to hold on to that old principle was unnecessary. Since that was what the brothers wanted, and Li Kexi himself had been more or less persuaded in his previous conversation with Prabhuv, accepting the personal overtures of the governor was met with little resistance. However, he did make one additional request in the end. I want to retain our name Beast Slaughter Group, as a separate designation. I heard from Prabhuv that the Alliance Army allows for this, he said. Ha ha ha. Gu Hang laughed heartily. Of course, I can agree to your request, but not right now. Then, seeing the puzzled look on Li Kexi's face, Gu Hang contained his laughter and spoke seriously. You want to preserve the name Beast Slaughter Group as the designation for your troops, then you must show corresponding performance. Go kill those green Skin Orcs. Once you've killed enough and truly upheld the Beast Slayer trait, I will grant you that designation. Li Kexi took a deep breath, his expression resolute. Then it's a deal. The adventuring group known as the Beast Slaughter Group completed their reorganization in the following days. 5,000 sets of G9 individual weapons were equipped, and they also received a new designation, the 3rd Independent Regiment. Gu Hang had spent 50 points of grace on them. After they completed their training and became T5 level troops, they also activated the combat experience accumulated within them, turning them into infantry with the Beast Slayer trait. The transformed 3rd Independent Regiment then returned to the battlefield. Although they were only equipped with many individual weapons, lacking regimental artillery and with not many mortars, largely just a significant number of rocket launchers, their G9 rifles were much better than their previous equipment. Moreover, the training conducted under the direct supervision of the governor over the past few days had made them feel a huge change in themselves. These changes were directly reflected on the battlefield. With the support of concentrated artillery firepower from the rear, the independent regiment could hold a defensive line of more than 10 kilometers on their own, with at most some help from militia regiments. Those so-called militia regiments were the original, other adventure groups. Over these past few days, it wasn't just the 3rd Independent Regiment that was reorganized. All other units also underwent reorganization while rotating into the Alliance Army camp for rest. Their willingness was also asked. Those who wished to stay as soldiers were reformed into garrison divisions. Although Gu Hang didn't have enough individual equipment to supply them all at once and did not intend to train all of them to T5 level right away without enough equipment, the combat effectiveness wouldn't be sufficient, so there was no point in wasting effort. But reorganization was still necessary, otherwise, command would be too chaotic. In the end, after seeing the treatment offered by the Alliance Army, the number of people willing to embrace change reached over 70,000. Just by comparison, one could understand that even just starting as privates in the Alliance Army offered them better conditions than their previous scavenging at Rubbish Town. Out of these 70,000, besides the Beast Slaughter Group, which was reorganized into an independent regiment of 6,000 troops, the remaining 63,000 were formed into 6 garrison divisions and assigned numbers 4 to 9. There was no major change in the weapon equipment, just promises of better treatment and a revision of the command hierarchy. Officers for the division and regiment levels were either transferred from the 2nd Division or from Perbuff's camp or were promoted from among the leaders of large adventure groups or highly respected adventurers. Moreover, it was impossible to extend political commissars down to the company level due to the massive scale of the reorganization. Currently, they could only be placed within division and regiment levels, where they were to develop loyalty to the Empire and to the governor from within, nurturing political instructors at the company and battalion levels. Additionally, more than 20,000 others did not wish to transition to soldiers but preferred to become ordinary civilians or to leave the alliance structure. Gu Heng did not let them go but temporarily employed them for combat at the pay grade of privates. They were formed into 10 militia regiments without specific numbers but just sequential ordinals, with their internal structures and command levels based on those of the original adventure groups. When garrison divisions rotated back to the front lines for combat, they would also be assigned some of the main tasks, while those militia regiments would be basically doing hard labor, like building fortifications. There was no need to use people as cannon fodder. Gu Heng did not do such things. It hadn't come to that. After reorganizing into 6 garrison divisions, if all the equipment is issued and the soldiers' training is completed, Gu Heng would have 9 division-sized units, which should be essentially sufficient for military power. With an army of nearly 100,000 and critically with higher quality equipment, future military expansion should not be too worrisome about the lack of troops. After all, besides fighting, the army also needed to be stationed locally. Recently recaptured areas, whether to retain or relocate populations, needed military presence to suppress resistance for policy implementation. Of course, that is a use for later. For now, the priority is the war against the green Skin Orcs. Gu Heng planned to hole up here for 2 months, fighting a defensive battle for that duration. In 2 months' time, the reorganization of the 9 division-sized units, the training requiring grace points, and the production and distribution of all light and heavy equipment should all be completed. Afterward, it would be time for a counter-offensive.